Before we begin tonight's story, I want to gently ask one small thing. If you truly enjoy these calm journeys into history, it would mean a lot if you left a like, and perhaps shared where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Only if it feels right for you. Thank you. Plato was born in 428 or 427 BCE, during a period when Athens stood at a crossroads between glory and decline. To understand his life and thought, we must first understand the world into which he was born, a world of astonishing cultural achievement, shadowed by the gathering storm of war. Athens in the mid-5th century BCE was the jewel of the Greek world. The city had recently defeated the massive Persian invasion, a victory that seemed almost miraculous to those who witnessed it. At Marathon, at Salamis, at Plataea, the Greeks, and particularly the Athenians, had turned back the forces of the world's largest empire, demonstrating that free citizens fighting for their own city could overcome the multitudes of a despotic king. The victory brought confidence, wealth, and prestige. Athens became the leading power in the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states that had formed to defend against future Persian attacks, but which gradually transformed into something resembling an Athenian empire. Tribute flowed into Athens from allied cities across the Aegean. The city's silver mines at Laurium produced wealth that funded an extraordinary flowering of architecture, sculpture, drama, and philosophy. Under the leadership of the Pericles, Athens rebuilt the temples on the Acropolis that the Persians had destroyed. The Parthenon rose in gleaming white marble, its proportions mathematically perfect, its sculptures representing a pinnacle of artistic achievement. The city constructed the Propylaea, the monumental gateway to the sacred precinct. Theatres were expanded, new public buildings erected, the Agora, the central marketplace and gathering place, beautified and organized. But Athens was more than just impressive buildings. The city had developed a political system that was revolutionary in its time. Democracy, rule by the demos, the people. Citizens, though this excluded women, slaves, and foreign residents, could participate directly in the assembly, voting on laws and policies, serving on juries, holding public office. It was imperfect by modern standards, certainly, but in a world of kings and tyrants, it represented something unprecedented. The democracy fostered a culture of debate and inquiry. Citizens were expected to speak publicly, to defend their positions, to listen to opposing arguments. This created an environment where rhetoric, logic, and persuasive speech were highly valued. Teachers called sophists traveled from city to city, offering to teach young men the skills of argumentation and public speaking in exchange for fees. Some sophists were serious thinkers, others mere verbal tricksters, but all contributed to an atmosphere where questioning and debate were central to civic life. Drama flourished in this environment. The great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, wrote plays that explored profound questions about fate, justice, the gods, and human nature. These were not mere entertainment, but civic rituals, performed at festivals honoring Dionysus, attended by thousands of citizens. The plays raised questions that had no easy answers, challenging audiences to think deeply about their values and beliefs. Philosophy, too, was beginning to emerge as a distinct form of inquiry. Pre-Socratic thinkers like Heraclitus and Parmenides had already begun asking fundamental questions about the nature of reality. What is the underlying substance of all things? Does change represent reality, or is reality eternal and unchanging? Can human reason penetrate to the truth, or are our senses necessarily deceptive? These questions might seem abstract, but they represented a radical departure from mythological explanations of the world, an attempt to understand reality through reason rather than through stories about gods and heroes. Into this world of achievement and inquiry, Plato was born. His family was distinguished on both sides. His father, Ariston, claimed descent from Codrus, the last king of Athens. His mother, Perictione, was related to Solon, the great lawgiver who had reformed Athenian law generations earlier. The family had wealth and connections to the highest levels of Athenian society. Plato's brothers, Adimantus and Glaucon, would later appear as characters in his dialogues. He had a sister, Potone, and the family connections extended throughout Athens's aristocratic class. Young Plato, his birth name was actually Aristocles. Plato was likely a nickname, possibly referring to his broad shoulders or forehead, would have received the education typical of an aristocratic Athenian boy. This included physical training in wrestling and athletics, musical education involving the lyre and the study of poetry, and intellectual training in mathematics, geometry, and the recitation and analysis of Homer and other classical poets. Homer's epics, the Iliad and Odyssey, were foundational to Greek education. Every educated Greek knew these poems by heart, drawing from them not just entertainment, but moral instruction, historical understanding, and cultural identity. The heroes of Homer embodied the aristocratic virtues, courage, honor, glory, excellence, but they also demonstrated human flaws, and the poems raised questions about the nature of heroism, the role of the gods in human affairs, and the meaning of a life well lived. This traditional education emphasized memory, recitation, and the absorption of cultural wisdom from the past. But Athens in the late 5th century was also experiencing new forms of education, particularly the teaching of the sophists. These traveling teachers offered instruction in rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, which was essential for success in democratic Athens, where political decisions were made through public debate and legal cases were argued before citizen juries. The sophists taught that through proper training, anyone could learn to argue any side of any question convincingly. Some emphasized that there was no absolute truth, only perspectives, and that success came from being able to argue more persuasively than one's opponents. This relativism was liberating to some, disturbing to others who believed in objective standards of truth and justice. But in Plato's childhood and youth, these philosophical questions were overshadowed by a more immediate concern: war. The year after Plato's birth, or perhaps the year of his birth, our ancient sources are not perfectly clear, Athens and Sparta entered into the conflict that would become known as the Peloponnesian War. Sparta was Athens's opposite in almost every way. Where Athens was democratic, commercial, maritime, and culturally innovative, Sparta was oligarchic, agricultural, land-based, and deeply conservative. Spartan society was organized around military excellence. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and raised in communal barracks, trained to endure hardship, to obey orders, to fight with perfect discipline. Spartan citizens were professional soldiers, their economic needs met by a class of agricultural workers called helots, allowing them to focus entirely on warfare. The two cities had been allies against Persia, but they had grown suspicious of each other in the decades since. Athens's growing power, its transformation of the Delian League into something resembling an empire, threatened Sparta's position as the dominant land power in Greece. Sparta's allies, particularly Corinth, urged war against Athens before Athenian power grew too great to challenge, and so, in 431 BCE, the war began. It would last, with brief interruptions, for 27 years. It would transform the Greek world, devastate both Athens and Sparta, and create the conditions that would profoundly shape Plato's development as a thinker. The confident, prosperous Athens into which Plato was born would be very different from the defeated, exhausted city of his young adulthood. In the early years of the war, Athens followed the strategy proposed by Pericles: avoid land battles with Sparta's superior army, use Athens's navy to raid Spartan territory and protect grain shipments to Athens, and wait for Sparta to exhaust itself. The strategy required the rural population of Attica to abandon their farms and take refuge within Athens's long walls, which connected the city to its port at Piraeus. Thousands crowded into the city, living in improvised shelters, separated from the land they had farmed for generations. In the second year of the war, disaster struck. A plague, we don't know exactly what disease, though typhoid fever or typhus are considered likely, swept through the crowded city. The close quarters, poor sanitation, and stress of the refugee situation created perfect conditions for epidemic. Thousands died, including Pericles himself. The plague returned in subsequent years, each time killing more of Athens's population. Young Plato, perhaps 2 or 3 years old when the first wave struck, survived. But the plague would have shaped his early memories, the sight of funeral pyres, the grief of families, the sense that the world was not necessarily ordered according to justice or reason, that catastrophe could strike without warning or meaning. These early experiences may have contributed to his later insistence that there must be a deeper order beneath the apparent chaos of the sensible world, a realm of permanence and reason behind the flux and suffering of everyday existence. The war continued year after year. Plato grew from childhood into adolescence against a background of periodic campaigns, shifting fortunes, occasional victories, and mounting costs. The confident optimism of the Periclean age gradually gave way to weariness, cynicism, and brutal pragmatism. The war coarsened Athens, making survival and victory seem more important than maintaining the cultural and ethical standards that had made the city great. Yet even during the war, Athens remained a center of intellectual and cultural activity. The theatre continued to present plays, sophists continued to teach, and in the agora, in gymnasia, in private homes, men continued to gather to discuss ideas, to debate questions of politics and ethics, to seek understanding of the world around them. It was in this context that a most unusual figure could often be found engaged in conversation. Socrates, a stonemason's son who spent his days in the marketplace, asking questions that made people uncomfortable, challenging conventional wisdom, and claiming to know nothing except that he knew nothing. Socrates wrote nothing himself, but he would become the central figure in Plato's life and the protagonist of nearly all his philosophical dialogues. We don't know exactly when Plato first encountered Socrates, but it would have been sometime in his youth, perhaps in his late teens. The meeting would prove to be the most important event of Plato's life, redirecting him from a probable career in politics to a life devoted to philosophy. But that meeting and its consequences would unfold gradually, as all profound influences do. For now, young Plato was receiving his education, learning the traditional curriculum, perhaps studying with some of the sophists, certainly absorbing the culture of late 5th century Athens, its brilliance and its darkness, its achievements and its failures, its nobility and its cruelty. He was being prepared, as aristocratic young men were, for a life of public service, for participation in Athenian democracy, for leadership in a city that was still, despite the war, the cultural center of the Greek world. But the world was changing, more rapidly than anyone fully understood. The war would end eventually, but it would end in ways that would shock Athens and force a generation to reconsider everything they had believed about their city, their values, and their future. And Plato, coming of age during these transformative years, would be among those forced to make sense of catastrophe and to ask whether there might be ways of thinking about truth, justice, and the good life that could survive even when cities fell and empires crumbled. The Agora of Athens in the late afternoon, this was where Socrates could most often be found. Not teaching in the formal sense, not delivering lectures from a raised platform, but simply talking, asking questions, engaging anyone who would listen in conversation about matters that most people took for granted. Socrates was unlike anyone else in Athens. He was not handsome. Contemporary accounts describe him as having a snub nose, prominent eyes, and a thick build that reminded people of a satyr, those mythical creatures, part man and part beast. He was not wealthy. He seems to have neglected his family's business to spend his time in philosophical conversation, supported by his wife Xanthippe, whose patience with her husband's unusual vocation has been much discussed over the centuries. He was not politically powerful, though he had served as a soldier and occasionally held civic office as citizens were required to do. He avoided the pursuit of political influence. What Socrates possessed was an extraordinary mind and an unshakable commitment to a particular kind of inquiry. He believed that most people lived in a state of confusion about the most important questions. What is justice? What is virtue? What is courage? What is piety? And that this confusion led them to live poorly, to make bad decisions, to harm themselves and others without even realizing it. He believed that through careful questioning and examination, it was possible to dispel confusion and approach truth, or at least to recognize clearly when one did not know what one claimed to know. His method, which would later be called the Socratic method or elenchus, involved asking someone to define a concept they claimed to understand. Courage, for example. The person would offer a definition. Socrates would then ask questions designed to test whether the definition was adequate, whether it covered all cases of the thing being defined and excluded all cases of things that were not the thing being defined. Almost invariably, the definition would prove inadequate. The person would offer a revised definition. More questions would reveal problems with the revision, and so on, until either a satisfactory definition emerged, which was rare, or the person was forced to admit that they did not actually understand what they thought they understood. This was not a comfortable experience. People did not enjoy discovering that they were confused about concepts they had confidently wielded their entire lives. Some who encountered Socrates became angry, accusing him of sophistry or trickery. Others dismissed him as a waste of time. But some, particularly young men who were drawn to intellectual inquiry, found the experience exhilarating. Here was someone who actually cared about getting to the truth, who was not satisfied with conventional answers, who believed that clear thinking about fundamental questions was the most important activity a human being could engage in. Plato was among those who found in Socrates something he had not found in his traditional education or in the teachings of the sophists. The exact circumstances of their first meeting are lost to history. Plato, despite writing extensively about Socrates, never included himself as a character in his early dialogues, maintaining an almost invisible presence as author. But based on references in later works and on what we know of Athenian society, the meeting likely occurred when Plato was in his late teens or early 20s, perhaps around 410 BCE. Plato would have been a young man of unusual promise at this time. He was athletic, intelligent, well-connected, and wealthy. He could reasonably expect a distinguished career in Athenian public life. His family had political connections, and in democratic Athens, a young man with his advantages could aspire to significant influence. He might have become a general, a prominent speaker in the assembly, a leader of policy. But Socrates offered something different. The possibility that there were questions more important than political success, that understanding the nature of justice mattered more than achieving power, that examining one's own life and beliefs was essential to living well. This must have been both disturbing and liberating for a young aristocrat educated in traditional values, disturbing because it called into question much of what he had been taught, liberating because it suggested that genuine understanding was possible for anyone willing to engage in honest inquiry. The relationship that developed between Socrates and Plato was not that of formal teacher and student in our modern sense. Socrates did not have a school, did not charge fees, did not claim to teach anything. He said he was not wise, but merely aware of his own ignorance, and that this awareness was itself a kind of wisdom. Recognizing what you don't know is better than falsely thinking you know what you don't know. His conversations were open to anyone who wanted to participate. Sometimes they occurred with a single interlocutor, sometimes with a small group, sometimes with a larger gathering. Plato became part of the circle of young men who spent time with Socrates, learning not by receiving instruction, but by participating in dialectical inquiry, the process of examining beliefs through question and answer, testing definitions, following arguments where they led, and being willing to abandon positions that proved untenable. Others in this circle included Crito, Phaedo, Antisthenes, and Plato's brothers Adiamantus and Glaucon. These men would later appear as characters in Plato's dialogues, immortalized in their conversations with Socrates. The topics they discussed ranged widely: ethics, politics, mathematics, the nature of knowledge, the relationship between the soul and the body, the existence and nature of the gods, the proper education of citizens. Some conversations were light, characterized by humor and friendly teasing. Others were intense, probing deeply into matters that had profound implications for how one should live. Central to many of these conversations was the question of virtue, arete in Greek, a word that means excellence or the fulfillment of one's proper function. What makes a human being excellent? Is virtue knowledge, something that can be taught? Or is it somehow inborn, a matter of natural disposition? Can someone know what is right and still do what is wrong? Or is wrongdoing always a form of ignorance? These were not abstract academic questions, but matters that directly affected how one lived, what one valued, what kind of person one tried to become. Socrates maintained paradoxical positions on these matters. He claimed that virtue was knowledge, that if someone truly understood what was good, they would do it, because no one willingly chooses what is bad for themselves. This seemed to contradict common experience, where people often knew what they should do, but failed to do it. But Socrates argued that in such cases, the person didn't truly know. They might have an opinion or a belief, but genuine knowledge would necessarily result in right action. He also maintained that it was better to suffer injustice than to commit it, that a good person could not be harmed by external circumstances, but only by their own actions, and that the most important task in life was caring for one's soul rather than pursuing wealth, power, or physical pleasure. These positions were radical departures from traditional aristocratic values which emphasized honor, reputation, and success in worldly affairs. During this period of his association with Socrates, which would last about 8 years from when they met until Socrates' death, Plato was also witness the final years of the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath. The war's course had turned against Athens. The Sicilian expedition of 415 to 413 BCE had been a catastrophic failure, with thousands of Athenian soldiers killed or captured. Sparta had allied with Persia, gaining access to Persian gold that funded a navy capable of challenging Athenian sea power. By 405 BCE, Athens' fleet was destroyed at Aegospotami, and the city was under siege. In 404 BCE, Athens surrendered. The long walls were torn down to the music of flute girls, marking the end of Athenian naval supremacy and the democracy that had depended on it. Sparta imposed a pro-Spartan oligarchy on Athens, a group of 30 men who came to be known as the 30 tyrants. Among these 30 was Critias, Plato's uncle, and another relative, Charmides, also participated in the regime. The 30 tyrants ruled Athens for about 8 months, and their rule was marked by confiscations, executions, and terror. They claimed to be restoring traditional values and purging Athens of corruption, but in practice they used their power to eliminate political enemies and to enrich themselves. Estimates suggest they executed or exiled hundreds or perhaps thousands of Athenians. The democratic constitution was set aside, and power was concentrated in the hands of this small group backed by Spartan military force. This created a profound moral and political crisis for Plato. His relatives were among the tyrants, and they apparently tried to involve him in their activities, offering him a position in the government. For a young aristocrat, this might have seemed an opportunity to have influence, to participate in what his relatives claimed was the restoration of proper order to Athens. But Plato was also a follower of Socrates, who had taught him to examine political claims critically, to ask whether power was being exercised justly, to care more about truth and virtue than about personal advantage. According to Plato's own account in his 7th letter, if the letter is genuine, which most scholars believe it is, he initially had some hope that the 30 might improve Athenian governance. But he quickly became disillusioned as he witnessed their actions. When they tried to implicate Socrates in their regime by ordering him to participate in the arrest of Leon of Salamis, an innocent man they intended to execute, Socrates simply refused. He went home instead, risking death himself rather than participating in injustice. This act of moral courage in the face of tyrannical power deeply impressed Plato and demonstrated that Socrates practiced what he preached about virtue. The 30 were eventually overthrown in 403 BCE, less than a year after they had taken power. Democratic exiles, led by Thrasybulus, defeated the oligarchs and their Spartan supporters and restored the democracy. An amnesty was declared. Most participants in the 30s regime would not be punished, a practical measure designed to allow the city to reconcile and move forward. Critias had died fighting the democratic forces. Charmides also fell. But Athens tried to put the experience behind it and rebuild its democratic institutions. Yet the restoration of democracy didn't bring peace to Socrates. In 399 BCE, 4 years after the democracy's return, Socrates was brought to trial on charges of impiety, not believing in the gods the city believed in and introducing new divinities, and of corrupting the youth of Athens. The charges were brought by 3 citizens, Melitus, Anytus, and Lycon, motivated by a mixture of genuine belief that Socrates was harmful and by political considerations related to his association with Critias and others who had been part of the 30. The trial was held before a large jury of Athenian citizens, perhaps 500 or 501 men, as was customary for serious charges. Socrates defended himself. There were no lawyers in the modern sense. Defendants spoke on their own behalf. According to Plato's account in the Apology, Socrates did not beg for mercy or make the emotional appeals that were common in Athenian trials. Instead, he defended his philosophical activity, arguing that far from corrupting the youth, he had been trying to improve Athens by examining beliefs and encouraging people to care about wisdom and truth rather than about wealth and reputation. He explained that he had spent his life questioning people because of a strange incident at Delphi years earlier, when the oracle had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates. Puzzled by this, since he believed he knew nothing, Socrates had begun questioning people who claimed to know things, politicians, poets, craftsmen, to find someone wiser than himself. What he discovered was that while these people knew some things about their own crafts, They falsely believed they understood profound matters they did not actually understand. Socrates realized that his wisdom consisted in recognizing his own ignorance, whereas others were ignorant but believed themselves wise. This explanation didn't help his case, nor did his statement that if he were acquitted on the condition that he stop philosophizing, he would have to refuse. He could not abandon what he believed the gods had called him to do. The jury found him guilty by a relatively narrow margin, perhaps 280 to 220. Under Athenian law, the accuser proposed one penalty, and the defendant proposed an alternative, and the jury chose between them. The accusers proposed death. Socrates, rather than proposing exile or a significant fine that might have saved him, proposed that Athens should honor him with free meals in the Prytaneum, the honor given to Olympic victors and great benefactors of the city. This did not persuade the jury. They voted for death, this time by a larger margin. Socrates was sentenced to die by drinking hemlock, a poison that would induce paralysis, progressing from the extremities to the vital organs. The execution was delayed for about a month due to a religious festival during which no executions could be carried out. This gave Socrates' friends time to visit him in prison, to have final conversations, and to arrange what they thought would be an escape. Plato was present for some of these final conversations, though he was apparently ill on the day of the execution itself. He mentions in the Phaedo that he was not among those present at the very end. The conversations during this final month would form the basis for some of Plato's most beautiful and profound dialogues, the Crito, in which Socrates explains why he will not escape even though his friends have arranged it, and the Phaedo, which recounts the discussion of the immortality of the soul that occupied Socrates' final hours. In the Crito, Socrates argues that escaping would be wrong because it would violate the implicit agreement he had made with Athens by choosing to live there and benefit from its laws his entire life. Even though he believed the verdict was unjust, he owed obedience to the city's legal processes. To escape would be to do injustice, and he had spent his life arguing that it was better to suffer injustice than to commit it. His principles had to be lived, not just discussed. The day of execution came. Socrates' friends gathered in his cell. They discussed philosophy until the end, the nature of the soul, the hope for immortality, the importance of living well, regardless of whether death meant annihilation or a transition to another existence. When the time came, Socrates drank the hemlock with remarkable composure. According to Plato's account, his last words were, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Make sure you pay the debt." Asclepius was the god of healing, and offering a rooster was a traditional thank offering for recovery from illness, suggesting perhaps that Socrates viewed death as healing, a release from the body's limitations. For Plato, then about 28 years old, the death of Socrates was devastating. It was not just the loss of a teacher and friend, but a profound shock to his understanding of Athens and justice. Here was a man who had been the best, wisest, and most just person in Athens, as Plato would later write. And Athens had killed him. The democracy that Athens prided itself on, the system that was supposed to embody collective wisdom, had condemned an innocent man for trying to make the city better. The experience confirmed for Plato that something was fundamentally wrong with how human beings thought about politics, justice, and knowledge. Conventional political systems, both democracy and oligarchy, had failed Athens. Political leaders claimed to know how to govern, but clearly didn't. The sophists taught techniques of persuasion without caring about truth. And the greatest philosopher Athens had produced had been put to death for trying to pursue wisdom and virtue. This crisis drove Plato toward philosophy, not as a leisure activity or intellectual game, but as a necessary response to the fundamental questions that Socrates' death made unavoidable. What is justice? What is knowledge? How should human beings live? How should cities be governed? Can virtue be taught? What is real, and how can we know it? These were not abstract puzzles, but urgent questions upon which the possibility of human flourishing depended. In the aftermath of Socrates' death, Plato left Athens. He would spend perhaps a decade traveling, studying, reflecting, and gradually developing the philosophical system that would represent his response to all he had witnessed. The young man who might have become an Athenian politician was becoming instead a philosopher who would change how humanity thought about nearly everything. After Socrates' execution in 399 BCE, Athens became a difficult place for those who had been associated with him. Though the amnesty protected them legally, there was suspicion and hostility from some quarters. The atmosphere was not conducive to philosophical inquiry, at least not the kind of searching questions that Socrates had asked. And for Plato, grief and disillusionment made remaining in the city painful. So he traveled. The ancient sources tell us he went first to Megara, a city near Athens, where Euclid, not the mathematician, but a philosopher who had been part of Socrates' circle, had established himself. There, with other followers of Socrates, Plato could continue philosophical discussions in a sympathetic environment, could process the trauma of recent events, and could begin thinking through how to preserve and extend Socrates' legacy. But Plato's travels extended far beyond Megara. Over the next decade or so, he journeyed throughout the Mediterranean world, seeking knowledge, observing different political systems, studying with various teachers, and gradually developing his own philosophical vision. The exact chronology and extent of these travels are uncertain. Our ancient sources are sometimes contradictory and often legendary. But the broad outlines seem reliable. He likely visited Egypt, where the ancient civilization's achievements in geometry, astronomy, and architecture were still visible in temples and monuments thousands of years old. Egyptian priests preserved knowledge that stretched back to time immemorial. Their society was rigidly hierarchical, stable, and deeply conservative, utterly unlike democratic Athens. Observing Egypt might have prompted Plato to think about what enabled some societies to maintain themselves for millennia, while others, like Athens, rose and fell within a few generations. He traveled to Cyrene in North Africa, where he may have studied mathematics with Theodorus, a geometer who would later appear as a character in his dialogue, the Theaetetus. Mathematics fascinated Plato. Here was a domain where truth was certain, where rigorous reasoning led to conclusions that were eternally valid, where mere opinion was replaced by genuine knowledge. a geometrical proof once established remained true regardless of changing circumstances, political upheavals, or cultural variations. This certainty contrasted sharply with the flux and uncertainty of the sensible world, and it suggested to Plato that perhaps there was a realm of perfect, eternal truth beyond the imperfect material world we perceive with our senses. He likely spent time in various Greek cities in southern Italy, a region known as Magna Graecia, where Greek culture had flourished for generations. Here, he would have encountered the Pythagorean communities, followers of Pythagoras who combined mathematics, philosophy, music, and religious practices into a distinctive way of life. The Pythagoreans believed that reality was fundamentally mathematical, that numbers were the underlying structure of all things. They practiced various purifications and disciplines, believing in the transmigration of souls and seeking to free the soul from the cycle of reincarnation through philosophical and spiritual development. Pythagorean influence is evident throughout Plato's mature philosophy. The emphasis on mathematics, the belief in the soul's immortality and its pre-existence before birth, the idea that the body is a kind of prison or tomb from which the soul must be liberated through philosophy, and the conviction that harmony and proportion reflect deep truths about reality. Though Plato was not simply a Pythagorean, his thought was more comprehensive and systematic. He clearly absorbed and adapted important Pythagorean insights. But the most fateful of Plato's travels took him to Syracuse, the major Greek city on the island of Sicily. Syracuse was ruled by Dionysius I, a tyrant, not in the modern sense of the word, but in the Greek sense of someone who seized power unconstitutionally and ruled with absolute authority. Dionysius was a capable military leader who had made Syracuse powerful, but he was also suspicious, cruel, and given to the excesses that absolute power enables. At Syracuse, Plato became friends with Dion, the brother-in-law of Dionysius. Dion was an unusual figure, a member of the tyrant's family, but also deeply interested in philosophy. He was attracted to Plato's ideas and became convinced that philosophy could transform politics, that rulers could become philosophers, or at least govern according to philosophical principles of justice rather than mere power and expediency. The relationship between Plato and Dion would prove to be both intellectually fruitful and ultimately tragic. But that part of the story would unfold over decades, for now the important point is that this first visit to Syracuse, which apparently ended badly, with Plato possibly being sold into slavery before being ransomed by friends, though the details are murky, gave him direct experience of tyranny and reinforced his conviction that political power without wisdom and virtue was dangerous. These travels, extending perhaps from 399 to about 388 BCE, were not mere tourism or flight from Athens. They were a form of education, a gathering of materials, mathematical knowledge, exposure to different political systems, study of various philosophical traditions that Plato would synthesize into his own distinctive philosophy. And gradually, during these years, he began to write. The dialogues Plato composed early in his career focused primarily on presenting Socrates' method and personality. These Socratic dialogues, works like the Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, and parts of the Laches and Charmides were relatively short, focused on particular questions, and usually ended without definitive answers. They demonstrated Socratic inquiry in action, showing how questioning could expose contradictions and inadequacies in conventional beliefs without necessarily providing positive doctrines to replace them. But Plato was also beginning to develop ideas that went beyond what Socrates had explicitly taught, or at least beyond what could be confidently attributed to the historical Socrates as opposed to Plato's own developing thought. Central among these was the theory of forms, sometimes called the theory of ideas, which would become the foundation of his mature philosophy. The theory of forms addressed a problem that had puzzled Greek philosophers. How do we have knowledge of things that are constantly changing? The world we perceive through our senses is in constant flux. Heraclitus had taught that you cannot step in the same river twice, for new waters are ever flowing upon you. If everything is changing, how can we have stable knowledge? Knowledge must be of what is, not of what merely appears temporarily and then vanishes. Plato's solution was to posit two realms of reality: the sensible world, the world of material objects we perceive through our senses, is indeed in constant change, imperfect and impermanent. But there is another realm, accessible to reason rather than to the senses, consisting of forms or ideas. These are eternal, unchanging, perfect templates or archetypes of which the things in the sensible world are mere imperfect copies or imitations. For example, there are many beautiful things in the world: a beautiful face, a beautiful sunset, a beautiful mathematical proof. But beauty itself is a form, an eternal and unchanging reality that exists independently of particular beautiful things. Individual beautiful things come into existence and pass away, vary in the degree of their beauty, and are beautiful only by participating in or imitating the form of beauty itself. Similarly, there are many just actions, but justice itself is a form that makes particular actions just to the extent that they participate in it. There are many circular objects, but they are circular only by approximating the perfect form of the circle, which exists eternally and can be fully grasped only by mathematical reasoning, not by sensory perception. This theory had profound implications. It meant that genuine knowledge was not of the sensible world, but of the forms. The philosopher's task was to turn away from mere appearances, the shadows on the wall, as Plato would later describe them, and to ascend through reason to knowledge of the forms themselves. This ascent was difficult, requiring rigorous training in mathematics and dialectic, but it was possible, and it represented the highest achievement of human intelligence. The theory also had ethical and political implications. If justice is a form that exists independently of human conventions and opinions, then there are objective standards of right and wrong, not just culturally relative beliefs. Political leaders should govern according to knowledge of the form of justice, not according to public opinion or personal interest. The right way to live is not whatever a particular culture happens to value, but what accords with the eternal truths about goodness and virtue that exist in the realm of forms. These ideas were revolutionary. They suggested that the sophists were fundamentally wrong. truth was not relative, and virtue was not just a matter of clever argumentation. They suggested that democracy might be flawed if it gave equal weight to the opinions of those who had knowledge and those who were ignorant. And they suggested that the philosopher who devoted himself to understanding the forms had access to truths that were more real and more important than the everyday concerns of commerce and politics. But these ideas also raised difficult questions. How exactly do we come to know the forms? How do imperfect, sensible things participate in perfect forms? Why are there these two realms in the first place? Plato would spend the rest of his life developing, refining, and sometimes modifying his answers to these questions. Around 387 BCE, perhaps 12 years after Socrates' death, Plato returned to Athens. He was now about 40 years old, no longer the young man who had fled in grief, but a mature philosopher with a developed vision and a clear purpose. He had traveled widely, studied extensively, and thought deeply about the questions Socrates had raised. And he had decided how he would spend the rest of his life: teaching philosophy in a systematic way, writing dialogues that would preserve and extend Socrates' legacy, and perhaps, though this would prove far more difficult, attempting to influence political practice in accordance with philosophical principles. He purchased property in a grove sacred to the hero Academos, outside Athens' city walls, and there he established his school. It would be called the Academy, after the grove, and it would become the most important educational institution in the ancient world, lasting for 900 years until the Christian emperor Justinian closed it in 529 CE. But that long history still lay ahead. For now, it was simply a place where those interested in serious philosophical study could gather, learn from Plato and from each other, and pursue wisdom in the way Socrates had taught, through rigorous questioning, honest inquiry, and a willingness to follow arguments wherever they led. The Academy was not a school in the modern sense of a building with classrooms and formal curricula. It was more like an extended community of scholars meeting for discussions, attending lectures, engaging in research, particularly in mathematics and natural philosophy. Students, or perhaps better to call them associates, since they were often adults, came from across the Greek world and beyond. Some stayed for a few years, others for decades, and over the door of the Academy, according to later tradition, was inscribed, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here," reflecting Plato's conviction that mathematical training was essential preparation for philosophy. The Academy gave Plato a platform from which he could influence Greek thought for the next 40 years. Here he would teach, write his most important dialogues, train students who would themselves become important philosophers and political leaders, and develop the first comprehensive philosophical system in Western history. A system addressing metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, aesthetics, and natural philosophy in a coherent, integrated framework. But teaching and writing were not Plato's only activities. He remained engaged with politics, not in the sense of seeking office in Athens, but in attempting to influence political practice elsewhere according to philosophical principles. This engagement would lead him back to Syracuse, to further encounters with tyranny, to hopes raised and disappointed, and to hard lessons about the relationship between philosophy and power. The rest of Plato's life would be divided between the contemplative work of philosophy at the academy and the active engagement with political reality in Syracuse and elsewhere. The tension between these two modes of life, the contemplative and the active, the philosophical and the political, is itself a central theme in his thought. Can philosophers make cities better? Should they try? Or should they remain in the safety of philosophical conversation, pursuing truth among friends, rather than risking corruption and failure in the messy world of political action? These questions would be tested in ways Plato could not have anticipated. But for now, having established the academy and found his vocation, he settled into the work that would occupy the rest of his days, thinking, teaching, writing, and trying to understand how human beings might live well, both as individuals and in communities. In the years following the establishment of the academy, Plato composed his longest and most influential work, the Republic. This dialogue, written probably in the 380s and 370s BCE, ostensibly addresses a simple question posed at its beginning: what is justice? But the inquiry expands far beyond that initial question to encompass the nature of the ideal political community, the proper education of citizens and leaders, the relationship between individual psychology and political structure, the nature of reality and knowledge, and ultimately the question of how one should live. The dialogue is set dramatically in the past, during the Peloponnesian War, and features Socrates in conversation with several other characters, including Plato's brothers Glaucon and Adeimantus, who serve as thoughtful, sympathetic interlocutors who help develop the argument. The conversation takes place at the Piraeus, Athens' port, in the home of Cephalus, a wealthy merchant. It begins with polite discussion, but quickly moves to deeper questions when Thrasymachus, a sophist, interrupts to challenge Socrates' views. Thrasymachus argues that justice is simply the advantage of the stronger, that in any city, whoever holds power defines what is just in ways that benefit themselves, and people obey out of fear of punishment. This view, representing a cynical political realism, claims that talk of objective justice is naive, that power is what matters, and that the so-called virtues are either useful for gaining power or foolish constraints that the powerful impose on the weak. Socrates engages with this challenge, but the real examination of justice's nature comes after Thrasymachus has been, if not fully persuaded, at least quieted. Glaucon and Adeimantus present what they call the strongest case against justice, asking Socrates to show not just that justice is prudent or expedient, but that it is choice-worthy for its own sake, that being just is intrinsically better than being unjust, even if injustice could be practiced with impunity. To answer this challenge adequately, Socrates proposes examining justice on a larger scale first, in a city rather than in an individual soul, on the principle that what is written large is easier to read than what is written small. This leads to the construction in speech of an ideal city, built from first principles according to reason rather than based on any existing political system. The city that emerges from this construction is radically different from Athens or any other Greek polis. It is divided into 3 classes, corresponding to 3 fundamental functions: the producing class, farmers, artisans, merchants, who provide material needs; the guardian class, soldiers and administrators, who protect the city and manage its affairs; and the ruling class, philosopher kings, who govern based on knowledge of the good. Each class has its proper virtue. The producing class should exhibit moderation, keeping desires in proper proportion. The guardians should exhibit courage, maintaining right belief about what is fearful and what is not. The rulers should exhibit wisdom, governing according to knowledge rather than opinion. And when each class performs its proper function without interfering with the others, the whole city exhibits justice, which is revealed to be a kind of harmony, each part doing its own work in proper relation to the whole. This political structure mirrors what Socrates argues is the structure of the human soul. Just as the city has 3 parts, the soul has 3 parts: the appetitive part, desires for food, drink, sex, and other bodily pleasures; the spirited part, emotions, especially those connected with honor and reputation; and the rational part, which seeks truth and understands the good. A just person is one in whom reason rules, spirit supports reason in controlling the appetites, and each part performs its proper function. Such a person is harmonious, healthy in soul, and genuinely happy, regardless of external circumstances. But how is such a city, or such a person, to be produced? Plato devotes enormous attention to education, arguing that forming the right character from childhood is essential. The guardians, in particular, must be educated carefully. Their early education involves gymnastics for the body and music, meaning not just musical training, but all the arts governed by the muses, including poetry. For the soul. However, much of traditional poetry must be censored or rewritten. Homer and the other poets often portray gods and heroes behaving badly, lying, lusting, fighting amongst themselves, fearing death, mourning excessively. These portrayals, Plato argues, provide terrible moral examples for young people who cannot yet distinguish myth from reality. If children are raised on stories of gods behaving unjustly, how can they learn to value justice? If heroes are shown fearing death, how can guardians develop courage? This censorship of poetry is one of the most controversial aspects of the Republic. Plato seems to be advocating for thought control, for restricting artistic freedom in service to political ends. But from his perspective, he is simply being honest about what traditional education already did. It shaped character through stories and examples, and he is asking whether we should do this deliberately and well, according to true standards, rather than accidentally and poorly, according to false beliefs about what makes a good person. Later in their education, after their characters have been properly formed, the future rulers will study mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, stereometry, 3-dimensional geometry, astronomy, conceived mathematically rather than observationally, and harmonics, the mathematical relationships in music. These studies train the mind to think about eternal, unchanging truths rather than about particular, changing things. They prepare the soul to turn from the sensible world toward the intelligible realm of forms. After extensive mathematical training, those who have proven capable will study dialectic, philosophy proper, the systematic examination of fundamental questions through reasoned argument. Only after this long education, extending into middle age, will they be ready to rule. And even then, they will rule reluctantly, having tasted the superior pleasures of philosophical contemplation and descending to political affairs only out of duty to the city that educated them. This education culminates in the most famous passage of the Republic, the Allegory of the Cave. Socrates asks Glaucon to imagine human beings living in an underground cave, chained so they can only face one wall. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall the prisoners face. The prisoners, having never seen anything else, take these shadows to be reality. Now imagine, Socrates continues, that one prisoner is freed and forced to turn around. The firelight hurts his eyes. He is confused and wants to return to watching the shadows. But he is dragged up the rough ascent out of the cave into the sunlight. At first, the light is overwhelming, and he can only look at shadows and reflections. Gradually, he can look at things themselves, then at the stars, and finally at the sun, which he recognizes as the source of light and life. If this person returned to the cave to help the others, he would have difficulty seeing in the darkness, and the other prisoners would think his vision had been ruined by going up above. They might laugh at him and resist any attempt to free them, preferring the shadows they know to a reality that seems threatening and incomprehensible. The allegory maps onto the metaphysical and epistemological framework Plato has been developing. The cave represents the sensible world of becoming, where we perceive through our senses. The shadows are images and reflections, the lowest level of reality. The objects casting shadows are physical things, slightly more real, but still imperfect copies. The journey out of the cave represents the soul's ascent through education to knowledge of the forms. The sun represents the form of the good, the highest principle that makes all other knowledge possible, just as the sun makes physical vision possible. The philosopher is the one who has made this journey, who has seen reality as it truly is. But having seen, he has a responsibility to return, to help others, to rule the city according to knowledge rather than opinion, to teach those capable of learning, to implement policies that promote genuine human flourishing rather than mere pleasure or power. This leads to perhaps the most radical claim in the Republic, that cities will never be well governed until philosophers become kings, or kings become philosophers, until political power and philosophical wisdom coincide in the same people. The claim scandalized many of Plato's contemporaries and has troubled readers ever since. It seems to advocate for a kind of benevolent despotism, a rule by experts that excludes most people from political participation. Plato is aware of the objection. He has Adeimantus point out that philosophers are either useless or vicious. Useless because they don't involve themselves in practical affairs, vicious because intellectual cleverness without moral grounding can produce sophistry and worse. Socrates responds with another image. Philosophers are like a skilled ship's pilot who understands navigation, but is ignored by the crew who think anyone can steer a ship and who fight amongst themselves for control. The pilot seems useless not because he lacks skill, but because those who need his expertise don't recognize its value. The Republic continues with discussions of the deterioration of constitutions, how the ideal city might decline through stages from aristocracy, rule by the best, through timocracy, rule by honor seekers, to oligarchy, rule by the wealthy, to democracy, rule by the many, and finally to tyranny, rule by the few, a despot who emerged from democratic chaos. Each political form corresponds to a psychological type, and Plato shows how each is worse than the previous, with tyranny being the most miserable both for the city and for the tyrant himself, who is enslaved to his own disordered desires. The dialogue concludes with the myth of air, a vision of the afterlife and the soul's journey through multiple incarnations. This myth, presented as revealed truth rather than as philosophically demonstrated knowledge, serves multiple purposes. It suggests that there are cosmic consequences for justice and injustice beyond what we see in this life. It reinforces the immortality of the soul, which Plato has argued for elsewhere. And it ends the dialogue with a call to care for one's soul above all else, to pursue wisdom and virtue, and to live in accordance with reason rather than being swept along by appetite and opinion. The Republic is a work of extraordinary ambition and complexity. It cannot be adequately summarized, only sketched. Its influence on subsequent political philosophy, ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics has been immense. Nearly every major philosophical question it raises is still debated today. Is there objective truth and value, or are these relative to cultures and individuals? Should political power be entrusted to those with expertise, or should it be shared equally among citizens? What is the relationship between individual flourishing and political community? How should children be educated? What role should art and poetry play in society? Many readers have found the Republic's political proposals troubling or even dangerous. The philosopher-kings seem like an authoritarian elite. The censorship of poetry threatens freedom of expression. The communal life proposed for the guardians, sharing property, sexual partners, and even children, seems to erase individuality, and the confidence that reason can determine the best way to live seems naive or arrogant. Other readers have seen in the Republic an inspiring vision of what human community could be if it were organized according to reason and justice rather than according to power and greed. They have valued its insistence that truth and goodness exist independently of opinion, that education should aim at genuine understanding rather than mere skill acquisition, and that those who govern should do so for the benefit of those they govern rather than for their own advantage. Plato himself may have viewed the Republic's ideal city not as a practical blueprint, but as a standard for judgment, a depiction of the perfectly just city against which actual cities could be measured and found wanting in specific ways. In the dialogue, Socrates acknowledges that the ideal city may exist nowhere on earth, but only in speech, as a pattern laid up in heaven. What matters isn't whether it can be realized perfectly, but whether it helps us understand what justice is and how we should try to live. Writing the Republic occupied Plato for years and represented the fullest expression of his mature thought. But the dialogue was not his final word on politics or anything else. He would continue developing his ideas, sometimes modifying positions taken in the Republic, sometimes addressing questions it had left open, always pursuing the truth wherever his arguments led. And alongside his theoretical work, he would continue to engage with practical politics, attempting to implement philosophical principles in actual cities, particularly in Syracuse. These attempts would teach him painful lessons about the difficulties of translating philosophical ideals into political reality, about the resistance that virtue meets in a world shaped by passion and interest, and about the costs of involvement in political affairs for those whose true home is philosophy. While Plato was developing his philosophical system and leading the academy in Athens, events in Syracuse drew him back to that dangerous city not once, but twice more after his initial visit decades earlier. These later visits in 367 and 361 BCE represent Plato's most sustained attempt to bring philosophy and political power together, and their failures would profoundly affect his thinking about the relationship between the contemplative and active lives. The background requires understanding what had happened in Syracuse since Plato's first visit around 388 BCE. Dionysius I, the tyrant who had ruled when Plato first came, died in 367 BCE after nearly 40 years in power. He was succeeded by his son, Dionysius II, a young man in his 30s who had little political experience. Dionysius I had apparently kept his son away from serious involvement in governance, perhaps fearing him as a potential rival. Dion, Plato's friend from the earlier visit, saw an opportunity. Dionysius II was young and inexperienced, but he was also reported to have some intellectual interests. If he could be educated in philosophy, if he could be guided toward ruling according to reason and justice rather than according to the brutal expediency that had characterized his father's reign, perhaps Syracuse could be transformed. And who better to undertake this education than Plato himself, the greatest philosopher of the age? Dion sent urgent letters to Plato, pressing him to come to Syracuse, arguing that a genuine opportunity existed to create a philosophical ruler, to realize in practice what had been discussed theoretically in philosophical conversations. Other friends and students from Sicily added their appeals. Plato, now about 60 years old, was reluctant. He had his school in Athens, his students, his writing. Travel to Syracuse would be arduous and potentially dangerous. Tyrants were notoriously unpredictable, and Syracuse's political situation was complex and volatile. But the opportunity called to him. In the Republic, he had argued that cities would not be well governed until philosophers ruled or rulers philosophized. Could he refuse when presented with an apparent chance to test this principle? If philosophers claimed to know how cities should be governed, but declined to try implementing their knowledge when opportunity arose, wouldn't that suggest a failure of conviction? And there was also his friendship with Dion, who had been influenced by Plato's teaching and who genuinely believed philosophical governance was possible. So, in 367 BCE, Plato made the journey to Syracuse for the second time. He arrived to find a complicated situation. Dionysius II received him with honor and initially seemed enthusiastic about philosophical study. But there were problems from the start. The young tyrant's existing advisors were suspicious of Plato's influence and of Dion's ambitions. They worked to undermine the relationship, suggesting to Dionysius that Dion was using Plato to gain power for himself. Moreover, Dionysius II proved to be a difficult student. He was interested in philosophy as a badge of culture and sophistication, something that would enhance his reputation, but he was not willing to undertake the rigorous, long-term study that genuine philosophical education required. He wanted the appearance of wisdom without the hard work of acquiring it. He was impatient with mathematics and dialectic, preferring discussions that made him look clever in front of others to sustained inquiry that might actually transform his thinking. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Within months, Dionysius exiled Dion, accusing him of conspiracy. Whether with any justification is unclear, but tyrants need not justify their actions. Plato was caught in an impossible position. His friend had been exiled. Ostensibly, the purpose for his visit had failed. Yet Dionysius insisted that Plato stay, apparently wanting to maintain the prestige of having the famous philosopher at his court, even if he was unwilling to actually study philosophy seriously. Plato remained in Syracuse for about a year before being allowed to return to Athens. The visit had accomplished little beyond demonstrating the difficulties of philosophical education in political contexts shaped by suspicion, flattery, and the corrupting influence of absolute power. Dionysius II was not going to become a philosopher king. The political environment of Syracuse was too hostile to philosophical inquiry and too driven by factional interests and personal ambitions. Back in Athens, Plato returned to teaching at the academy and to his writing. But he remained concerned about Dion, who was living in exile in mainland Greece and hoping to return to Syracuse. Dion had not given up on the idea of reforming Syracuse's government, though his plans were now more radical. He was contemplating military action to overthrow Dionysius II and establish a more moderate constitution. In 361 BCE, Dionysius sent another invitation to Plato, this time claiming that he had matured, that he genuinely wanted to study philosophy, and hinting that Dion's situation might be improved if Plato came. Plato was even more reluctant than before. He had seen how the previous visit ended. But again the appeal was powerful. Perhaps Dionysius had indeed changed. Perhaps this time serious philosophical education could take root. And perhaps he could help his friend Dion. So at age 67, an age when most men were settling into retirement, Plato made the arduous journey to Syracuse for a third time. This visit was even worse than the second. Dionysius proved no more serious about philosophy than before. The political situation was more dangerous, and Plato found himself essentially a prisoner, unable to leave when he wished, caught in the machinations of court intrigue and tyrannical caprice. Eventually, through the intervention of friends and probably some luck, Plato was allowed to depart in 360 BCE. He returned to Athens, determined never to involve himself in Sicilian politics again. He had tested the possibility of philosophical rule under what seemed like favorable conditions. A young tyrant supposedly interested in philosophy, guided by someone trained in Plato's own thought. and it had failed decisively. The lessons were painful, but clear. Political power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely in ways that resist even philosophical education. Those who rule are surrounded by flatterers and sycophants who reinforce vice rather than virtue. The habits of tyranny, suspicion, cruelty, self-indulgence become ingrained and cannot easily be overcome through philosophical conversation. And political circumstances often make genuine philosophical inquiry impossible. For philosophy requires honesty, willingness to admit ignorance, and subordination of ego to truth, qualities that rarely survive in the competitive, dangerous environment of politics. But the story of Syracuse was not over. In 357 BCE, Dion launched a military expedition against Dionysius II. With a small force and taking advantage of Dionysius's absence on a campaign in Italy, Dion seized control of Syracuse. It seemed at first like a triumph. The philosopher-influenced leader had overthrown the tyrant and would now establish the kind of moderate, law-governed constitution that Plato had advocated. But power proved corrupting even for those educated in philosophy. Dion governed increasingly autocratically, making decisions without consultation, eliminating rivals, behaving more like a tyrant himself than like the philosophical ruler he had hoped to be. In 354 BCE, just 3 years after his successful coup, Dion was assassinated by Callippus, one of his own associates, who was himself a student from Plato's academy. The irony and tragedy were devastating. The attempt to bring philosophy and power together had not only failed, but had contributed to further violence and instability. A student of Plato had murdered another student of Plato. The dream of philosophical governance had collapsed into a nightmare of faction and betrayal. Plato, now in his mid-70s, witnessed all this from Athens. He wrote the 7th letter, if it is indeed by him, which most scholars believe, partly to explain his involvement in Sicilian affairs and to defend his actions. In it, he reflects on his political disappointments and offers his most direct autobiographical reflections. He explains that he had initially hoped to enter Athenian politics, but was repelled by the 30 tyrants' behavior. When democracy was restored, he again considered political involvement, but was shocked by Socrates' execution. These experiences convinced him that cities as currently constituted were almost all badly governed, their laws and customs corrupt, and that political reform without philosophical transformation of values and beliefs was impossible. He had hoped that in Syracuse, starting with a young ruler and with the opportunity to educate him from the beginning, things might be different. But he had learned that even under seemingly favorable circumstances, the obstacles to philosophical governance were immense. The letter's tone is one of sadness and resignation, not cynicism or despair, but realistic acknowledgement that the gap between philosophical ideals and political reality was wider than he had hoped. These failures in Syracuse influenced Plato's later political thought. In his final dialogue on politics, The Laws, composed in his last years, he presents a constitution that is much more detailed, practical, and modest than the ideal city of the Republic. The Laws describes what Plato calls a second-best constitution, suitable for actual human beings, rather than for the idealized guardians of the Republic. In this second-best city, there are no philosopher kings. Instead, there is a detailed legal code that embodies philosophical principles insofar as possible, governing everything from marriage and property to education and religious observances. The city is smaller, more traditional in some ways, and its laws are designed to shape character over generations through habit and custom rather than through the direct rule of philosophical wisdom. The laws represents a kind of compromise with reality, an acknowledgement that while the perfect cannot be achieved, something better than what currently exists might be possible through careful legal construction and sustained attention to education. It is the work of an old man who has learned through hard experience about human limitations, political constraints, and the resistance that ideals meet in practice. Yet even this compromise is significant. The laws still insists that there are objective standards of justice, that law should aim at virtue rather than merely at order or prosperity, that education is crucial for forming good character, and that governance should be rational rather than arbitrary. The goals have not changed, only the assessment of what can realistically be achieved and by what means. Plato's engagement with Syracuse raises profound questions that remain relevant today. Can philosophy influence politics constructively? Should philosophers try to implement their ideas, or should they remain in universities and schools, pursuing truth and teaching students, but not attempting to reshape political institutions? When philosophical principles are applied to politics, do they improve governance, or do they become corrupted, turning philosophers into just another faction seeking power? There are no simple answers. Plato tried to implement his ideas and failed, but perhaps the fault lay not in the attempt, but in the particular circumstances, trying to work through a tyrant rather than through constitutional reform, working in a city already deeply corrupted rather than in a founding situation, attempting rapid transformation rather than gradual development over generations. Or perhaps the failure reveals something deeper, that political reality is always messier, more complex, and less amenable to rational planning than philosophers suppose. That the knowledge philosophers claim about justice and virtue, even if genuine, does not easily translate into knowledge about how to govern actual cities with their particular histories, cultures, and circumstances. That the very qualities that make someone a good philosopher, love of truth, willingness to question everything, preference for contemplation over action, may actually make them poor at practical politics. Plato himself seems to have wrestled with these questions without reaching a final resolution. He never renounced the claim that philosophical wisdom should guide political practice, but he also recognized that achieving this conjunction was far more difficult than he had once hoped, and that philosophers might serve their cities better through education, through teaching the next generation to think more clearly about justice and virtue, than through direct involvement in political affairs. These lessons, bought at considerable personal cost and emotional pain, shaped his final years. He returned from Syracuse for the last time older, wiser about human limitations, and more focused on the work he could do effectively. Teaching at the academy, writing dialogues that would preserve his insights for future generations, and cultivating in his students the love of wisdom that might, over time, gradually elevate human understanding, even if it could not quickly transform political institutions. The sun sets over Athens, casting long shadows across the Academy's grounds. An old man sits in the garden, surrounded by younger men who listen as he speaks about justice, about the nature of the good, about the education of the soul. His voice is calm, his manner gentle, but his words carry the weight of a lifetime spent pursuing wisdom and the authority of one who has tested his ideas against the hardest realities of power and politics. This is Plato in his final years, having learned that philosophy's greatest contribution may not be in ruling cities, but in teaching those who can think clearly about how cities should be ruled, in preserving the possibility of rational inquiry even when the world seems irrational, and in maintaining faith that truth exists and matters even when power and opinion seem to rule everything. While Plato's attempts to influence Syracuse's politics ended in disappointment, his creation of the Academy represented a more enduring success. From its founding around 387 BCE until his death in 347 BCE, the Academy served as the institutional center for philosophical education and research, a community of scholars devoted to pursuing wisdom through rigorous intellectual inquiry. The Academy was not a school in our modern sense, with formal courses, examinations, and degrees. It was rather an association, something like what we might call a research institute combined with a philosophical commune, where individuals gathered to study, discuss, and investigate questions in philosophy, mathematics, and natural science. Some members were young students beginning their education. Others were mature scholars pursuing specialized research. All were united by commitment to philosophical inquiry and by acceptance of Plato's basic approach, even if they sometimes disagreed with specific doctrines. The property where the Academy was located included gardens, a gymnasium, and buildings for meetings, and perhaps for some members to live. The atmosphere was one of serious study, but also of friendship and shared life. Members ate together, exercised together, and spent long hours in conversation. This communal dimension reflected Plato's conviction that philosophical education wasn't merely intellectual, but also moral and social. Learning to think well required living well, and both required community. The curriculum at the Academy reflected Plato's understanding of how philosophical education should proceed. Students began with mathematics, arithmetic, plane geometry, solid geometry, astronomy, and harmonics. These studies had both practical and philosophical purposes. Practically, they trained the mind in rigorous reasoning, in moving from hypotheses through logical steps to necessary conclusions. Philosophically, they turned the soul from the changeable world of sense perception to the unchanging truths accessible to reason alone. Mathematics was considered propedeutic, preparatory for philosophy proper. A student who could not follow geometrical demonstrations, who could not think about abstract relationships and necessary truths, was not yet ready for dialectic, the philosophical method of examining fundamental concepts and principles through question and answer. The famous inscription over the Academy's entrance, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here," reflected this conviction that mathematical training was prerequisite for serious philosophy. After sufficient mathematical preparation, students would begin studying dialectic. This involved reading and discussing philosophical texts, including works by earlier philosophers and Plato's own dialogues. But more importantly, it involved engaging in philosophical conversation, learning to ask the right questions, to recognize assumptions, to test definitions, to construct and evaluate arguments. The method was Socratic, derived from what Plato had learned from his teacher. A topic would be proposed. What is courage? What is knowledge? What is the good? And participants would examine it together, offering definitions, considering objections, refining their accounts. The goal was not to defeat opponents or to display cleverness, but to approach truth cooperatively, with all participants helping each other toward better understanding. This was demanding work, requiring intellectual ability, certainly, but also moral qualities. Honesty to admit when one's position was refuted, humility to recognize one's ignorance, courage to question received opinions, persistence to continue inquiry even when answers remained elusive. Plato believed that genuine philosophical education formed character as well as intellect, that the discipline of following arguments wherever they led cultivated virtues that extended beyond theoretical inquiry into practical life. The Academy also conducted research, particularly in mathematics and natural philosophy. Some of the greatest mathematicians of antiquity were associated with the Academy. Theaetetus developed important work in geometry and number theory. Eudoxus contributed to mathematics and astronomy, developing geometrical models of planetary motion that would influence astronomy for centuries. The research was not disconnected from philosophy, but was understood as part of the broader project of understanding reality through reason. Plato himself continued teaching and writing throughout these decades. He was apparently an engaging teacher, capable of drawing students into deep examination of difficult questions while maintaining an atmosphere of respect and genuine inquiry. He did not simply lecture, transmitting doctrines to be memorized, but engaged students in dialogue, forcing them to think for themselves, to articulate and defend positions, to recognize and address objections. His teaching must have been flexible, adapting to different students' abilities and interests. Some sources suggest he taught advanced doctrines orally that do not appear in the written dialogues, perhaps because he believed certain teachings required direct engagement between teacher and student and could be misunderstood if simply read. Whether this is true, and if so, what these unwritten doctrines were, remains debated among scholars. During his years at the Academy, Plato also composed many of his most important dialogues. After the Republic, he wrote works that continued developing his philosophical system, while also addressing problems and questions that earlier dialogues had raised. The Parmenides, for instance, presents a rigorous critique of the theory of forms, raising problems about how forms relate to particular things and how forms relate to each other. The dialogue is philosophically technical and challenging, apparently intended for advanced students who already understood the basic theory and were ready to grapple with its difficulties. Whether Plato thought the problems it raises were fatal to the theory, or merely challenges to be addressed through further refinement, remains unclear. The Theaetetus examines the nature of knowledge, considering and rejecting several definitions before ending, like many Socratic dialogues, without a final answer. But the examination is extraordinarily thorough, introducing distinctions and arguments that would shape epistemology, the theory of knowledge, for centuries. What is the difference between knowledge and true belief? Can knowledge be defined as true belief with an account? These questions, first rigorously examined in the Theaetetus, remain central to philosophy today. The sophist and statesman form a pair examining what it means to be a sophist and what it means to be a statesman, contrasting each with the philosopher. These dialogues show Plato working out a more sophisticated metaphysics and logic, addressing how being and non-being relate, how we can speak meaningfully about what is not, how to divide kinds into their natural species. The technical philosophical work here is impressive, suggesting that Plato's thought continued developing and deepening even in his later years. The Timaeus presents Plato's most extensive treatment of natural philosophy, his account of the physical world's creation and structure. Presented as a likely story rather than as certain knowledge, since the sensible world is in flux and cannot be fully known, the Timaeus describes how a divine craftsman, the demiurge, fashioned the cosmos according to eternal forms, creating a world that is as good and beautiful as a physical world can be. The dialogue includes speculative cosmology, physics, psychology, and even medicine, attempting to show how the mathematical structures underlying reality make the physical world intelligible. And then, in his final years, Plato composed the Laws, his longest work, a detailed constitution for a second-best city. The Laws is less dramatic than the Republic, written mostly as a lecture rather than as a conversation. But it shows Plato thinking practically about how law and custom can shape character and promote virtue in an actual city, given human limitations, and without relying on the perfected nature of philosopher kings. Through all these works, certain themes recur: the primacy of reason over appetite and emotion, the existence of objective truth and goodness, the immortality of the soul, the importance of education, the need for political order to reflect rational principles, and above all, the conviction that philosophy, the love and pursuit of wisdom, represents the highest human activity and the path to genuine happiness. But Plato was not dogmatic. His dialogues often end without definitive conclusions. They raise questions as much as they answer them. They invite readers to think for themselves, to engage with arguments rather than simply accepting doctrines. This reflects Plato's understanding that philosophical truth cannot simply be transmitted from teacher to student like factual information, but must be discovered by each person through their own thinking, guided by dialogue with others who are also seeking truth. The Academy attracted students from across the Greek world and beyond. They came to study with Plato, to participate in the Academy's intellectual life, and to pursue wisdom in an environment dedicated to that pursuit. Some stayed for a few years, others for decades. Some became philosophers themselves, continuing the tradition of Platonic thought. Others returned to their home cities to participate in political life, hopefully bringing philosophical insight to practical affairs. Among the students, one would prove to be the most famous, Aristotle, who came to the Academy as a teenager, around 367 BCE and remained for nearly 20 years until after Plato's death. Aristotle would eventually develop his own philosophical system, disagreeing with Plato on fundamental points, but he was deeply influenced by his teacher and always acknowledged the importance of his education at the academy. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle is worth contemplating. Plato was in his 60s when the teenage Aristotle arrived, already the author of most of his important works, the most distinguished philosopher of the age. Aristotle was brilliant, ambitious, and independently minded. The two apparently had genuine respect for each other, but they also had fundamental disagreements about the nature of reality, the theory of forms, the relationship between universals and particulars, and the proper method for philosophical and scientific inquiry. Plato must have recognized Aristotle's extraordinary ability. He reportedly called him the mind of the academy. But he must also have been aware of their philosophical differences. This apparently did not lead to a breach. Philosophy at the academy was not about enforcing orthodoxy, but about pursuing truth through rigorous inquiry. And genuine inquiry requires tolerance for disagreement and for following arguments wherever they lead. When Plato died in 347 BCE, Aristotle did not succeed him as head of the academy. Instead, that position went to Plato's nephew, Speusippus, who would lead the academy in a direction emphasizing mathematics and tending toward a more Pythagorean interpretation of Plato's philosophy. Aristotle eventually left Athens and would later found his own school, the Lyceum, developing a philosophical approach that was in many ways opposed to Platonism. But this, too, reflects something important about Plato's legacy. He had not created a sect demanding allegiance to doctrines, but had established a tradition of inquiry that could develop in multiple directions. His students and successors would disagree with each other, would modify or reject aspects of his teaching, would develop their own philosophical systems. Yet all would have been shaped by their engagement with Plato's thought, by the questions he had raised, by the methods he had taught, by the conviction he had instilled that philosophy mattered and that truth was worth pursuing. The academy itself would continue for centuries after Plato's death, through various transformations and under different leaders. It would remain a center of philosophical education and research, preserving and developing the Platonic tradition, even as that tradition evolved and diversified. Not until 529 CE, more than 900 years after its founding, would the Byzantine Emperor Justinian close the academy along with other pagan schools, bringing to an end one of the longest continuous institutional traditions in Western civilization. But long before that ending, the academy had fulfilled its purpose. It had provided a space where philosophy could be pursued seriously and systematically. It had trained generations of thinkers who would influence their own times and preserve philosophical learning for future generations. It had demonstrated that a community devoted to rational inquiry and the pursuit of wisdom could sustain itself across centuries, and it had preserved Plato's dialogues and teachings, ensuring that his ideas would continue to shape human thought long after the institution he had founded had passed into history. In the grove of Academus, beneath olive trees and surrounded by gardens, Plato spent his final decades teaching, writing, and conversing with students and friends. It was a life of the mind, devoted to understanding reality, pursuing goodness, and helping others do the same. The political disappointments of Syracuse were behind him. The grief over Socrates' death had been processed and transformed into philosophical work that honored his teacher's memory. And the academy provided a context where the love of wisdom could be cultivated and shared, where the examined life Socrates had called for could be lived in community with others who valued the same things. This was Plato's true achievement, not ruling a city, not implementing an ideal constitution, but creating a space and a tradition where human beings could think deeply about the most important questions, where reason could be cultivated, where truth could be pursued, and where generation after generation could learn that there are things more valuable than wealth, power, or pleasure. Wisdom, virtue, and understanding. To understand Plato's enduring influence, we must explore more fully the philosophical vision at the heart of his thought, the theory of forms. This theory, sometimes called the theory of ideas, represents Plato's answer to fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, and value that had perplexed Greek philosophers before him and that continue to challenge thinkers today. The problem begins with change. Everything in the physical world is constantly changing. Heraclitus had emphasized this, teaching that everything flows, that you cannot step into the same river twice because new waters are always flowing. If this is true, how can we have knowledge? Knowledge must be of something stable and unchanging. If what we claim to know is constantly becoming something else, our supposed knowledge refers to something that no longer exists by the time we articulate it. Moreover, the things we perceive through our senses are imperfect and varied. No two beautiful things are beautiful in exactly the same way. No two circles drawn in sand are perfectly circular. No two just actions embody justice identically. Yet we use universal terms, beauty, circularity, justice, as if they referred to something common to all particular instances. What are these universals, and how do they relate to particulars? Plato's theory of forms addresses these puzzles by positing a two-tiered reality. The sensible world, the world we perceive through our senses, consists of particular things that are constantly changing, imperfect, and transient. But there is also an intelligible realm, accessible to reason rather than to sense perception, consisting of forms, eternal, unchanging, perfect archetypes of which sensible things are mere imperfect copies or imitations. Consider beauty. There are many beautiful things in the world: a beautiful sunset, a beautiful face, a beautiful melody, a beautiful mathematical proof. These particular beautiful things come into existence and pass away. They are beautiful in different ways and to different degrees. They are imperfect. Even the most beautiful face ages, even the most stunning sunset fades. But beauty itself, the form of beauty, is eternal, unchanging, and perfect. It exists independently of particular beautiful things, and they are beautiful only by participating in or imitating it. The same applies to every universal we can think about. There is a form of justice which particular just actions approximate, a form of circularity, which particular circular things imperfectly embody, forms of goodness, truth, equality, and countless others. These forms are the ultimate reality, the truly real things, while the sensible particulars we encounter in everyday life are mere shadows or reflections of the forms. This theory has profound implications for knowledge. Genuine knowledge, what Plato calls episteme, is not of the changing, imperfect, sensible world, but of the eternal, perfect forms. When we truly know something, what we know is not this particular beautiful thing or that particular just action, which will change and cease to exist, but beauty itself or justice itself, which are eternal and unchanging. But how do we come to know the forms? We cannot perceive them with our senses. The form of beauty is not visible or tangible. It can only be grasped by the mind through reason. Plato suggests several routes to this knowledge. One is through mathematics. Geometers study perfect circles, perfect lines, perfect triangles, not the imperfect drawings we make on paper, but the forms these drawings merely represent. Mathematical knowledge is certain and eternal precisely because it is of forms, not of sensible things. Another route is through dialectic, the philosophical method of examining concepts through question and answer, testing definitions, considering relationships, following arguments. When we examine what justice is, we are trying to articulate the form of justice, to bring into clear thought what justice is in itself, apart from any particular just action. But there is also, Plato suggests, a kind of recollection involved. In the dialogue Meno, Socrates demonstrates that an uneducated slave boy can arrive at geometrical truth through proper questioning, suggesting that knowledge was somehow already in him, requiring only midwifery to bring it to consciousness. Plato explains this through the doctrine of recollection. The soul, before being embodied, existed in the realm of forms and had direct knowledge of them. Birth involves forgetting this knowledge, and learning is actually remembering what the soul once knew. This connects to Plato's teaching about the soul's immortality. The soul is not material, but is akin to the forms, eternal, unchanging in its essence, and capable of knowing the forms because of its affinity with them. The body, by contrast, is material, changing, and mortal. The soul's association with the body is temporary, and the soul's true home is the intelligible realm of forms, not the sensible world of material particulars. The forms are organized hierarchically. At the apex stands the form of the good, which Plato describes in the Republic as like the sun in the visible world, just as the sun makes physical sight possible and gives life to growing things. The form of the good makes knowledge possible and gives being to all other forms. The good is not just another form alongside the others, but is somehow beyond being, the source from which all other forms derive their reality and intelligibility. This is mysterious and difficult doctrine. Even in the Republic, Socrates says he can only describe the good through images and analogies, rather than directly. The good seems to represent ultimate reality and ultimate value combined. It is what makes everything else real, and it is what makes everything else valuable, insofar as it is good. Knowledge of the good is the highest philosophical achievement and requires years of mathematical and dialectical training to approach. The theory of forms provides Plato with foundations for ethics and politics, as well as for metaphysics and epistemology. If justice is a form that exists independently of human conventions, then moral relativism is false. There are objective standards of right and wrong, not just culturally variable beliefs. The philosopher who knows the form of justice knows how people should act and how cities should be governed, not as a matter of opinion, but as a matter of knowledge. This is why philosopher kings should rule. They are not better politicians in the sense of being more skilled at manipulation or rhetoric. They are better rulers because they have knowledge of the forms, particularly of the good, and can therefore govern according to objective standards of justice and goodness rather than according to opinion, self-interest, or the shifting preferences of the multitude. But the theory of forms also raises serious problems, some of which Plato himself explored in dialogues like the Parmenides. How exactly do sensible particulars participate in or imitate forms? If the form of beauty is separate from beautiful things, how does it make them beautiful? If we need the form of beauty to explain why many things are all beautiful, don't we then need another form to explain what the form of beauty and beautiful things have in common, leading to an infinite regress? There are also questions about which things have forms. Does every universal have a corresponding form? Is there a form of mud or a form of hair, as well as forms of beauty and justice? What about mathematical numbers and geometric figures? Are these forms or something else? Do artificial objects like beds and tables have forms, or only natural kinds and abstract concepts? Plato seems to have wrestled with these problems, and his later dialogues show him refining and sometimes modifying the theory. But he never abandoned the core insight, that there must be some level of reality that is stable and unchanging, some objects of knowledge that are eternal and perfect, some standard of truth and goodness that exists independently of human opinion and sensory appearance. For modern readers, the theory of forms can seem strange or even mystical. We are used to thinking of reality as consisting of physical things and processes, with abstract concepts like beauty or justice being merely human constructions or linguistic conveniences. The idea that beauty or justice exists as an independent, eternal reality seems to multiply entities beyond necessity or to confuse thoughts with things. But Plato would argue that the alternatives are worse. If there is no objective reality corresponding to our concepts, then knowledge reduces to opinion, truth becomes relative, and there are no standards for judging better and worse, right and wrong, beautiful and ugly. The sensible world of constant change cannot ground knowledge, which requires stability. Mathematical truths are not merely conventional or subjective. They are discovered, not invented, suggesting they refer to something real beyond human minds. Moreover, the theory of forms makes sense of certain experiences that are otherwise puzzling. When we recognize that two things are equal despite being different in every particular way, what are we recognizing? When we judge that a particular action falls short of perfect justice, what standard are we applying? When we understand a geometrical proof, what exactly are we understanding? Not the imperfect diagram, but the perfect geometric relationships it represents. The theory suggests that human reason can transcend the limitations of sensory experience, that we can know truths that are eternal and universal, and that the highest human activity is contemplating these eternal truths rather than pursuing the fleeting pleasures and goods of the sensible world. This is what makes philosophy superior to all other pursuits. It alone aims at knowledge of what is ultimately real and valuable. Plato's metaphysical vision is also beautiful in a particular way. It suggests that beneath the apparent chaos and imperfection of the world we experience, there is perfect order and beauty. Every beautiful thing points toward beauty itself. Every instance of justice reflects justice itself. The cosmos, despite containing evil and suffering, is structured according to goodness and intelligence. There is meaning and purpose built into reality itself, not just projected onto it by human minds. This vision has inspired countless thinkers across centuries. Early Christian theologians found in Platonism a philosophical framework for understanding God and spiritual realities. Medieval philosophers synthesized Platonic and Aristotelian thought to create comprehensive worldviews. Renaissance thinkers revived Platonism as an alternative to rigid scholasticism. Even modern philosophers who reject the theory of forms often find themselves responding to problems Plato identified and exploring alternatives to his solutions. The question of universals, whether general concepts correspond to real entities or are merely names we give to similarities between particulars, remains a live issue in metaphysics. The problem of how mathematical knowledge is possible continues to challenge philosophers of mathematics. The question of whether moral values are objective or relative echoes ancient debates between Plato and the sophists. And the puzzle of how to reconcile scientific explanation with humanistic understanding reflects tensions present in Plato's distinction between the sensible and intelligible realms. Whether or not one accepts the theory of forms, engaging with it deepens philosophical thinking. It forces consideration of what knowledge requires, what reality consists in, how particulars relate to universals, and whether there are objective standards of value or only subjective preferences. These are not idle academic puzzles, but questions that affect how we understand ourselves, our knowledge, our values, and our place in the universe. For Plato himself, the theory wasn't just an abstract metaphysical hypothesis, but a vision that guided his entire life. It explained why philosophy mattered more than wealth or power, because philosophical contemplation of the forms brought the soul into contact with what is truly real and truly good. It justified his educational program at the academy. Mathematics and dialectic prepared the soul to ascend from shadows to reality. It grounded his political hopes. Just governance required knowledge of justice itself, not merely clever manipulation of opinion. And it provided consolation. In a world where the good suffer and the wicked prosper, where justice seems absent and virtue unrewarded, the theory of forms asserts that appearances deceive. True reality is just beautiful and good. The philosopher who knows the forms understands that what seems most real, physical things, bodily pleasures, political power, is actually least real, mere shadows of genuine reality. And the philosopher who lives accordingly, caring for the soul above all else, participates in eternal truth, regardless of what happens in the temporal world. As evening falls over Athens and stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, an old philosopher sits contemplating truths that have occupied him for decades. The beauty of the stars points toward beauty itself. The order of their movements reflects mathematical relationships that are eternal. And somewhere beyond the visible heavens lies the realm of forms, the true home of the soul, perfect and unchanging, waiting to be known by those who turn their minds from shadows toward light. This is the vision Plato offered to humanity, that reality is ultimately intelligible, that reason can grasp truth, that goodness and beauty are real and eternal, and that the examined life, devoted to understanding these things, is the best life a human being can live. Whether we accept this vision or not, it remains one of the most profound and influential attempts to make sense of existence that human thought has produced. Among Plato's most persistent concerns was the nature and fate of the human soul. In several dialogues, the Phaedo, Phaedrus, Republic, and others, he presents arguments for the soul's immortality and explores what this immortality means for how we should live. This was not merely academic speculation for Plato, but touched the deepest questions of human existence. What are we, fundamentally? Is there something in us that transcends death? Does the ethical life have significance beyond this brief span of years? The Phaedo, which recounts Socrates' final hours before his execution, makes the question of immortality central. Socrates' friends are devastated that he is about to die, but Socrates remains calm, even cheerful. He explains that the philosopher has been practicing death his whole life, not death as annihilation, but death as the separation of soul from body, and therefore should welcome actual death as the culmination of philosophical life. This requires explanation. Plato distinguishes sharply between the soul and the body. The body is material, composite, changeable, and mortal. It has appetites and desires that distract from reason. It requires constant maintenance, feeding, rest, protection from harm. It is subject to illness and inevitably decays. The soul, by contrast, is immaterial, simple, unchanging in its essence, and allied with reason. It is capable of knowing the forms, which are also immaterial and eternal. It is not subject to physical decay. The body, Plato suggests, is actually an obstacle to genuine knowledge and virtue. Bodily pleasures distract us from contemplating truth. Bodily needs consume time and energy that could be devoted to philosophy. The body's perceptions are unreliable. Our senses show us constantly changing appearances, not stable reality. True knowledge comes through reason, not through sense perception, and reason operates best when the soul withdraws as much as possible from bodily interference. This is what philosophy does. It practices separating the soul from the body, training the soul to ignore bodily distraction and to focus on intelligible realities accessible to thought alone. Death simply completes what philosophy has been working toward all along, the complete separation of soul from body, freeing the soul to contemplate the forms without any bodily limitation. But this assumes the soul survives death. Socrates offers several arguments for this conclusion in the Phaedo. One argument appeals to the theory of recollection. We have knowledge that cannot have come from sensory experience alone. Knowledge of perfect equality, for instance, which no sensible things perfectly embody. This knowledge must have been acquired before birth, when the soul existed independently of the body and could directly apprehend the forms. If the soul existed before birth, there is reason to think it will exist after death as well. Another argument appeals to the soul's simplicity. Composite things, things made of parts, can decompose, falling apart into their constituents. But the soul is not composite. It is simple and indivisible. What is simple cannot decompose and therefore cannot die. The soul is more like the forms, which are eternal and unchanging, than like bodily things, which are composite and perishable. A third argument examines what it means for something to be alive. The soul is what makes a body alive. A body without a soul is a corpse. The soul is essentially connected with life. It is what brings life to whatever it occupies. But what is essentially connected with life cannot admit its opposite, death. Therefore, the soul cannot die. It is immortal by its very nature. These arguments are complex and have been debated for over 2 millennia. Are they sound? Do they establish what Plato claimed? Even in the Phaedo, Socrates' interlocutors raise objections, and Socrates acknowledges that certainty about what happens after death is difficult. But he argues that we should live as if the soul is immortal, because this belief leads to the best life, and the risk of being wrong is minimal compared to the benefit of being right. The Phaedo also includes a myth about the afterlife. After death, Socrates recounts, souls are judged. Those who have lived philosophically and justly go to a blessed existence in the company of gods and pure souls. Those who have lived viciously go to punishment, undergoing purification for their wrongdoing. And most souls, neither entirely good nor entirely bad, undergo a mixed fate, experiencing consequences appropriate to how they lived. This myth serves multiple purposes. It provides consolation. Death is not annihilation, but transition to another form of existence. It reinforces morality. Justice will ultimately be done, even if not in this life. And it encourages philosophy. The life devoted to wisdom and virtue will be rewarded, while the life devoted to bodily pleasure and material gain will prove to have been misdirected. But the myth is presented as a likely story, not as demonstrated truth. Plato is careful about what he claims to know, and what he presents as reasonable belief supported by argument, but not certain. The soul's immortality can be argued for philosophically, and Plato thinks the arguments are strong. What happens to the soul after death is less certain. Myths and traditional teachings provide guidance, and it is reasonable to live according to them. But they do not constitute knowledge in the strict sense. In the Phaedrus, Plato offers another image for understanding the soul. The soul is like a charioteer driving 2 horses, one noble and one base. The noble horse represents spirited emotions like honor and shame that can be trained to support reason. The base horse represents appetitive desires that pull toward bodily pleasure and away from reason. The charioteer is reason itself, trying to direct the whole soul toward what is truly good. This image captures the complexity of human psychology. We are not simply rational beings. We have emotions and desires that often conflict with reason's judgments. Virtue consists in achieving harmony among the soul's parts, with reason ruling, spirit supporting reason, and appetite being controlled rather than being allowed to dominate. This harmony is both intrinsically valuable. A harmonious soul is healthier and happier than a discordant one, and instrumentally valuable. It enables us to pursue genuine goods rather than being distracted by lesser pleasures. The Phaedrus also describes how the soul, before being embodied, travelled in the company of gods, beholding the forms in their eternal splendour. But souls fall from this blessed state when they cannot maintain their vision of reality, and they are born into bodies. Life becomes a struggle to recollect what was seen before birth, to recover through reason and philosophical discipline the knowledge that embodiment has caused us to forget. Beauty plays a special role in this recollection. When we encounter beautiful things in the world, our souls remember the form of beauty they once beheld, and this memory awakens love, eros, the desire to reconnect with beauty itself. Properly directed, this love leads upward from beautiful bodies to beautiful souls, to beautiful practices and institutions, to beautiful knowledge, and finally to beauty itself. This is a philosophical ascent that Plato describes in the Symposium, where love is revealed as fundamentally a desire for immortality and for union with the eternal. But if love is misdirected, if it fixates on bodily beauty and sexual pleasure rather than ascending toward beauty itself, it remains trapped at the lowest level, pursuing shadows rather than reality. This is why Plato sometimes sounds puritanical about bodily pleasures, not because pleasure is intrinsically evil, but because it distracts from higher goods and can become an end in itself rather than a step toward something better. The soul's immortality also grounds Plato's approach to ethics. If death were annihilation, one might argue that ethical considerations apply only within this life, and that one should pursue whatever brings pleasure or advantage here and now. But if the soul is immortal and carries the effects of its choices into the afterlife, then ethics has ultimate significance. How we live shapes what we are, and what we are continues beyond death. This is why Socrates insists, in both the Apology and the Gorgias, that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. Committing injustice harms the soul, making it disordered and vicious, and this harm persists. Suffering injustice might harm the body or one's external circumstances, but it doesn't harm the soul if one maintains justice in one's own character. Since the soul is what truly matters, and since the soul's condition affects one's state after death, virtue is essential, regardless of consequences in this life. Plato's teaching about immortality has influenced Western thought profoundly, especially through its influence on Christianity and Islam. Early Christian theologians found in Plato a philosophical articulation of the soul's survival of death, the judgment after death, and the importance of moral purification. Though Christian doctrine developed in directions that differed from Plato, including bodily resurrection, which Plato did not teach, the Platonic framework provided conceptual tools for thinking about spiritual realities. The teaching is also personally affecting. Faced with mortality, with the death of loved ones and the prospect of one's own death, the idea that the soul continues provides comfort and meaning. If this life is all there is, then death is absolute loss. But if the soul is immortal, then relationships based on love of wisdom and virtue can continue beyond death, and the good we achieve in this life has lasting significance. Yet modern readers often find Plato's soul-body dualism problematic. We understand human beings as psychosomatic unities, not as souls trapped in bodies. Brain science suggests that mental functions depend on physical processes, challenging the idea of an immaterial soul. And the denigration of the body and bodily life can seem unhealthy, leading to denial of legitimate physical needs and pleasures. Plato might respond that we regularly distinguish between our true selves and our bodies. We say, "I have a body," rather than "I am a body." We recognize that bodily desires often conflict with what reason judges best, suggesting that we are not simply identical with our physical organisms. And we value activities of mind and character more highly than mere physical pleasures, implicitly acknowledging a hierarchy among human goods that Plato was trying to articulate. Whether or not the soul is literally immortal in the way Plato claimed, his emphasis on the examined life, on caring for one's soul above all else, on pursuing wisdom and virtue rather than mere pleasure and power, represents insight into human flourishing that transcends particular metaphysical commitments. Even those who believe death is annihilation can agree that how we live matters, that character is more important than circumstances, that intellectual and moral development represent genuine goods worth pursuing for their own sake. And there is something moving about Socrates' calm acceptance of death in the Phaedo, his cheerfulness in the face of execution, his continued philosophical conversation up to the very end. Whether his confidence in immortality was justified or not, his example demonstrates that philosophy can provide resources for facing mortality with dignity, that understanding and virtue matter more than prolonging physical existence, and that a life devoted to wisdom is its own reward, regardless of what follows death. As Socrates drinks the hemlock and feels the numbness spreading through his limbs, he continues talking with his friends, reassuring them, asking them to continue pursuing philosophy, requesting that they pay the small debt he owes. His last words, according to Plato, are, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Make sure you pay the debt." The request is puzzling. Why does Socrates, in his final moments, think of this small offering? Perhaps he views death as healing, a release from the illness of embodiment. Perhaps he is reminding his friends that one should honor one's obligations, even small ones, even at death's threshold. Perhaps he is demonstrating that the philosophical life extends to the very end, maintaining concern for justice and proper conduct even when facing the ultimate transition. Whatever his intention, the scene has moved readers for over 2,000 years, presenting an image of philosophical death that affirms life's meaning while accepting its end, that faces the unknown with reason and courage, and that suggests there are things worth more than mere survival. This is Plato's teaching about immortality distilled into a final moment. The soul that has lived well, that has pursued wisdom and virtue, can meet death without fear, trusting that whatever comes next, it has lived as it should. Central to Plato's philosophy is the conviction that virtue can be taught, though not in the way sophists claimed to teach it. Virtue is not a technique that can be learned through rhetoric and clever argumentation. It is rather a condition of soul that must be cultivated through proper education extending from childhood through maturity. How to educate human beings so they become virtuous occupied Plato throughout his career and found expression in his political dialogues, especially the Republic and Laws. Plato's understanding of education, paideia in Greek, was comprehensive. It was not merely instruction in skills or transmission of information, but the formation of the whole person, shaping character, developing capabilities, and orienting the soul toward truth and goodness. Education, so understood, was the essential task of any decent political community, more important than military defense or economic prosperity. Because the kind of people a city produced determined everything else about it. The Republic presents Plato's most detailed educational program, designed for the guardian class who would protect and govern the ideal city. This education begins in childhood with what Plato calls music and gymnastics, music meaning not just musical training, but all the arts governed by the muses, including poetry, stories, and literature, gymnastics covering physical training and development. The early education is crucial because character is formed when young. Children absorb whatever they are exposed to without critical distance. Stories about gods and heroes, songs and poems, images and examples, all shape the developing soul before reason is mature enough to examine and judge. Therefore, what children encounter must be carefully chosen to promote proper values and attitudes. This leads to Plato's controversial program of censoring traditional poetry. Homer and Hesiod, the foundational poets of Greek culture, often portrayed gods and heroes behaving badly, lying, committing adultery, mourning excessively, fearing death. These portrayals, Plato argues, provide terrible moral education. If children believe gods act unjustly, how will they learn justice? If heroes fear death, how will guardians develop courage? Therefore, poetry for children must be reformed. Stories should portray gods as good, incapable of evil, unchanging, truthful. Heroes should embody virtue, displaying courage, self-control, justice, and wisdom. Only stories with good moral examples should be allowed. Those that might corrupt character should be excluded or rewritten. This censorship troubles modern readers who value artistic freedom and resist governmental control of literature. But Plato would respond that we already exercise such control, implicitly, if not explicitly. We judge some materials inappropriate for children and restrict their access. We choose carefully what stories to tell, what shows to allow, what examples to present. Plato is simply being honest about what education already does, and asking us to do it deliberately and well, rather than accidentally and poorly. The early education also includes physical training, not primarily for military purposes, but for soul development. Gymnastics trains the spirited part of the soul, developing courage, endurance, and discipline. But it must be balanced with music, which gentles the spirit and cultivates the emotional and aesthetic sensibilities. Too much gymnastics without music produces people who are harsh and violent. Too much music without gymnastics produces people who are soft and weak. The right balance creates harmonious souls capable of both courage and gentleness. As students mature, their education continues with mathematics. Arithmetic teaches about number and quantity in the abstract, training the mind to think about purely intelligible objects rather than sensible things. Geometry studies space and shapes in their perfect forms, not as imperfectly instantiated in physical objects. Stereometry extends this to 3 dimensions. Astronomy, properly understood, studies the mathematical relationships governing celestial motions, not merely cataloguing observable phenomena. And harmonics explores the mathematical ratios underlying musical intervals and concordance. These mathematical studies are not pursued for practical utility, though they have utility, but because they turn the soul from the sensible to the intelligible realm, from becoming to being, from appearance to reality. Mathematics exemplifies certain knowledge of eternal truths, showing that human reason can grasp realities beyond sensory perception. This prepares students for the highest study, dialectic philosophy proper. Dialectic, which begins only after thorough mathematical preparation, and only for those who have proven capable, involves systematic examination of fundamental concepts and principles. What is justice itself? What is beauty? What is knowledge? What is being? What is the good? Through collaborative inquiry, testing definitions, considering objections, following arguments, students approach understanding of the forms, and ultimately of the form of the good, which is the highest object of knowledge and the source of all reality and value. This education culminates in a long period of practical experience. After completing their theoretical education, the future guardians serve in various civic and military capacities, testing their character in real situations, learning practical wisdom to complement their theoretical knowledge. Only after proving themselves in practice, after age 50, do they become full guardians, able to rule the city according to knowledge of the good. This educational program is demanding and lengthy, extending from childhood through middle age. Only a few would complete the entire course. Most would stop at earlier stages, serving the city in capacities suited to their development. But those who completed the full program would be truly qualified to rule, possessing both theoretical knowledge of what is good and practical experience in implementation. The education Plato describes is also comprehensive in its attention to all aspects of human development. It trains the body through gymnastics, the emotions through music and poetry, the reason through mathematics and philosophy. It develops both theoretical and practical capabilities. It aims at creating not just skilled workers or effective soldiers, but complete human beings, capable of living well and of helping others do the same. In the Laws, Plato's final work, he again addresses education, but in a more practical context. The city described in the Laws is a second-best constitution, acknowledging human limitations that the ideal city of the Republic perhaps ignored. Here, education is not just for an elite guardian class, but for all citizens, with different levels and types appropriate to different roles. The education in the Laws pays more attention to habit and custom, recognizing that most people are not guided primarily by reason, but by habituation to good practices. Laws and institutions should be designed to form good habits, to make virtue feel natural, to create a culture where excellent conduct is normal and expected. This requires attention to everything from marriage customs to religious festivals, from property laws to recreational activities, all understood as contributing to character formation. Plato also emphasizes the importance of play in early childhood education. Children learn through games and stories, absorbing rules and developing dispositions before they can understand philosophical justifications. The games children play, the stories they hear, the songs they sing, all shape character in ways that formal instruction later builds upon. Throughout his discussions of education, Plato maintains that virtue is knowledge, but must become habitual disposition. Someone who understands what justice is, but has not habituated themselves to just action, will struggle to act justly when faced with temptation or difficulty. True education forms both understanding and character, uniting knowledge with practice so that virtuous action becomes second nature. This insight remains relevant. We recognize that moral education requires more than just teaching ethical principles. It requires modeling good behavior, creating environments that reinforce virtue, providing practice in making good choices, and building communities that support ethical development. Abstract knowledge of right and wrong is insufficient if not combined with habitual disposition toward right action and away from wrong. Plato would also insist that education never really ends. Even mature adults should continue learning, continue examining their beliefs and values, continue developing their understanding. The examined life that Socrates called for is a lifelong project, not something completed and then set aside. Philosophy is not just preparation for life, but a constituent of the good life itself. The Academy embodied this conviction. It was not just a school for young people, but a community of scholars of all ages united by commitment to philosophical inquiry. Members continued studying and discussing throughout their lives, understanding that the pursuit of wisdom had no terminus short of death, and perhaps not even then. This comprehensive attention to education reflects Plato's conviction that human beings are not born virtuous, but become so through proper formation. We have the capacity for virtue. We have reason that can understand the good, spirit that can support reason in pursuing it, and appetites that can be trained to pursue healthy pleasures in moderation. But these capacities must be developed through education, through culture, through law, and through community. A city that neglects education, that allows children to be exposed randomly to good and bad influences, that fails to cultivate virtue systematically, should not expect to produce virtuous citizens. Conversely, a city that takes education seriously, that thoughtfully designs its institutions and culture to promote human excellence, has the best chance of producing people who will sustain and improve the community across generations. This explains why Plato devoted so much attention to education in his political philosophy. He recognized that political institutions alone cannot ensure good governance. Laws and constitutions matter, certainly, but they depend on the people who implement and obey them. If citizens and leaders are vicious, no constitutional structure will produce justice. But if citizens and leaders are virtuous, even imperfect institutions can function reasonably well. Therefore, the most important political question is not what laws should we have, but what kind of people should we be? And this question is answered primarily through education, through the systematic cultivation of human excellence from childhood through maturity, attending to body, emotion, and reason, developing both knowledge and character, creating harmonious souls capable of living well individually and communally. As the Academy's students gather in the evening for discussion, they represent Plato's educational ideal in practice. Some are young, just beginning their philosophical education. Others are mature scholars, pursuing advanced research. All are engaged in the collective pursuit of wisdom, learning from each other, challenging and refining each other's thinking, cultivating both understanding and virtue through philosophical community. This is Plato's enduring contribution to educational thought. The vision of education as formation of the whole person for the sake of human flourishing, pursued systematically through developmentally appropriate methods, aiming ultimately at knowledge and virtue, and understood as essential to both individual happiness and collective well-being. Whether in ancient Athens or modern societies, these insights remain vital for anyone concerned with how we might become better than we are. Among Plato's most moving and influential dialogues is the Symposium, which explores the nature of love, eros, through a series of speeches delivered at a drinking party in Athens. The dialogue presents multiple perspectives on love before culminating in a speech by Socrates, recounting what he learned from a wise woman named Diotima. This teaching about love's ascent from beautiful bodies to beauty itself represents one of Plato's most poetic and philosophically rich contributions. The Symposium is set at a banquet held to celebrate the tragedian Agathon's victory in a dramatic competition. The participants agree to deliver speeches in praise of Eros, the god of love, each approaching the topic from a different angle. The early speeches offer various perspectives: love as desire for one's other half, love as pursuit of honor and glory, love as harmony and moderation. But all treat Eros as fundamentally about desire and relationship between individuals. When Socrates' turn comes, he begins by questioning whether love is actually a god, as the previous speakers assumed. Through his characteristic method of examination, he establishes that love is desire for what one lacks, and that gods, being perfect, lack nothing, and therefore cannot desire. Therefore, love cannot be a god, but must be something in between mortal and divine, a spirit or demon connecting the human and divine realms. Socrates then recounts what Diotima taught him about love's true nature and purpose. Love, she explained, is desire for the good and beautiful, but more precisely, it is desire to possess the good and beautiful forever. This makes love fundamentally a desire for immortality, for permanent possession of what is good rather than temporary, fleeting experience of it. Human beings pursue immortality in various ways. Those whose love is primarily of a body seek immortality through reproduction, creating children who will outlive them and carry their line forward. This is the lowest form of love's quest for immortality, but it is nonetheless a real expression of eros, the desire to possess the good permanently by creating new life. But there are higher forms of love. Those whose love is primarily of the soul seek immortality through creating lasting achievements, poetry, laws, institutions, ideas that will outlive their physical bodies. This is why poets and legislators and teachers pursue their work with such passion. They are driven by eros to create something permanent that embodies value, something through which they can achieve a kind of immortality even after death. But the highest form of love, Diotima teaches, begins with attraction to beautiful bodies, but does not remain fixated there. Instead, it ascends through stages toward beauty itself, the form of beauty that is eternal and perfect. This is the famous ladder of love that has influenced Western thought about beauty, value, and transcendence for over 2 millennia. The ascent begins when someone is attracted to a particular beautiful body. This physical attraction awakens eros, desire for the beautiful. But if properly guided, the lover soon recognizes that beauty is not unique to one body, but is shared by many bodies. This leads to love of bodily beauty, generally, rather than fixation on a single individual. From appreciation of beautiful bodies, the soul ascends to recognition of beautiful souls, understanding that beauty of character is superior to physical beauty, that virtue and wisdom are more valuable than mere pleasant appearance. This leads to love of beautiful souls, to the desire to be with and to cultivate virtue in those one loves. From beautiful souls, the ascent continues to beautiful practices and institutions, the activities and social arrangements that promote human flourishing. One comes to love just laws, good customs, excellent governance, recognizing these as beautiful because they embody wisdom and promote virtue. From beautiful practices, the soul ascends to beautiful knowledge, to sciences, philosophers, and branches of learning that reveal truth about reality. One falls in love with understanding itself, with the systematic comprehension of how things are, finding beauty in coherent explanations and elegant theories. And finally, from beautiful knowledge, the soul ascends to beauty itself, the form of beauty, eternal, unchanging, perfect, the source of all particular beautiful things. This vision of beauty itself, Diotima teaches, is the ultimate goal of eros. The lover who achieves this vision apprehends something eternal and perfect, participates in immortality through contemplation of what is truly real, and experiences happiness that surpasses all merely human pleasures. This ascent is not automatic. It requires proper guidance. A philosophical teacher who has made the ascent can help others begin their journey. It requires discipline, resisting the temptation to remain fixated at lower levels, continuing the ascent even when earlier stages seem satisfying. And it requires a kind of conversion, turning the soul from attachment to temporal, changing things toward love of eternal, unchanging reality. The Symposium's teaching about love transforms how we understand eros. It is not merely sexual desire or romantic attachment, but is fundamentally the human soul's longing for the good and beautiful, its aspiration toward something perfect and eternal. All particular loves are expressions of this deeper longing, attempts to grasp and possess permanently what is valuable. This explains both the intensity and the frustration of human love. We love intensely because we are seeking something infinite through finite means. We experience frustration because particular beautiful things inevitably disappoint. Bodies age and die, relationships end or grow stale, achievements prove less satisfying than anticipated. But these disappointments should not lead to cynicism. Rather, they should redirect us toward the real object of our longing, the good and beautiful itself, which alone can satisfy the soul's deepest desires. The teaching also connects love with philosophy. The philosopher is literally a lover of wisdom, philosophia. But wisdom is beautiful, and loving wisdom is part of the ascent toward beauty itself. Philosophy is driven by eros, by passionate desire to know truth, to understand reality, to grasp what is eternal and perfect. The detached, purely intellectual image of philosophy misses this dimension of passionate engagement that Plato emphasizes. Socrates himself exemplifies philosophical eros. His life was devoted to seeking wisdom, to the passionate pursuit of understanding. He was not dispassionate or merely curious, but was driven by powerful desire to know what justice is, what virtue is, what the good is. This desire shaped his entire life, led him to spend his days in philosophical conversation, and ultimately gave him the courage to face death rather than abandon his philosophical mission. The Symposium ends with a remarkable scene. After the speeches, including Socrates' account of Diotima's teaching, the party continues drinking late into the night. Others gradually fall asleep or leave, but Socrates remains awake, still discussing philosophy until dawn, then going about his usual activities without rest. The image captures something essential about Plato's vision. The philosopher is the one who remains awake while others sleep, who continues seeking truth while others are satisfied with comfort, who is sustained by love of wisdom rather than by physical needs. The dialogue's teaching about love influenced not just philosophy, but Western culture more broadly. The idea of ascending from physical to spiritual love became central to medieval Christian mysticism, where the ladder of love led ultimately to union with God. Renaissance Platonists celebrated beauty as a pathway to divine truth. Romantic poets invoked Platonic love in their explorations of passion and transcendence. Even modern conceptions of love, as involving both physical and spiritual dimensions, echo Plato's analysis. But the teaching also raises questions. Does ascending the ladder of love require abandoning or devaluing earlier stages? Must love of beauty itself replace love of particular beautiful persons, or can they coexist? Is there something cold about seeking eternal perfection rather than embracing finite, imperfect, human relationships? Can the philosopher who has glimpsed beauty itself still meaningfully engage with the everyday world of change and imperfection? Plato seems to suggest that the ascent does not require abandoning lower stages, but rather transforms how we engage with them. The lover who has glimpsed beauty itself will still appreciate beautiful bodies, souls, and practices, but will see them now as imperfect reflections of perfect beauty, valuable, but not ultimate. Particular loves remain meaningful, but are understood in their proper context, as steps toward or expressions of the soul's longing for the eternal. The Phaedrus complements the Symposium's teaching, describing love as a kind of divine madness, a possession that lifts the soul beyond ordinary consciousness. The lover who sees physical beauty is reminded of the beauty the soul beheld before birth, and this memory awakens passionate desire to recover that vision. This divine madness, properly directed, becomes philosophical eros, the driving force behind the soul's ascent toward truth. Together, these dialogues present love not as a distraction from philosophy, but as philosophy's motivating force. We pursue wisdom because we love it, because we desire truth and beauty and goodness with the same intensity that drives romantic passion. Philosophy without eros would be merely technical analysis, lacking the commitment and passion necessary to sustain lifelong inquiry. Eros without philosophy remains fixated on particular objects, never ascending to their eternal source. The synthesis of love and wisdom, eros and philosophy, represents one of Plato's deepest insights. Human beings are not purely rational calculators, dispassionately analyzing propositions. We are driven by desire, by love, by passionate engagement with what we value. Philosophy works with these passions, redirecting them toward appropriate objects, purifying them through understanding, and ultimately uniting them with reason in the contemplation of eternal truth. As sunset paints the Athenian sky in shades of rose and gold, a philosopher watches the display of color and light with appreciation that goes beyond mere sensory pleasure. The beauty before him awakens memory of beauty itself, eternal and perfect. The desire it evokes is not for physical possession, but for understanding, for seeing more clearly the good that manifests itself in every beautiful thing. This is eros transformed by philosophy, passion united with wisdom, love ascending toward its true object. This vision of human life as animated by love of the good and beautiful, capable of ascending from temporary pleasures to eternal truth, finding ultimate fulfillment in philosophical contemplation, remains one of Plato's most inspiring contributions. Whether or not one accepts his metaphysics, the idea that our deepest desires point toward something transcendent, that love can be educated and elevated, and that passion and reason can unite in pursuit of wisdom, continues to resonate with anyone who has felt the pull of beauty or the longing for understanding. The final decade of Plato's life, from his late 60s through his death at age 80 or 81 in 347 BCE, was spent primarily at the academy, teaching, writing, and refining the philosophical system he had developed over 40 years. The disappointments of Syracuse were behind him. His major dialogues had been composed. His students included some of the most brilliant minds of the generation. Now, in his final years, he could focus on the work that had always been central, the pursuit of wisdom through philosophical inquiry. During this period, Plato composed the Laws, his longest and final work. Unlike his earlier dialogues, which featured Socrates as the main speaker, the Laws is narrated by an unnamed Athenian stranger, perhaps representing Plato's own voice more directly. The dialogue presents a detailed constitutional plan for a new colony being founded on Crete, addressing everything from marriage and property laws to education and religious observances with remarkable thoroughness. The Laws represents Plato's mature political thought, tempered by decades of experience and by the failures in Syracuse. Where the Republic described an ideal city that might exist only in speech, the Laws describes a practical, second-best constitution designed for real human beings with all their limitations. There are no philosopher kings here, no radical communism of property and family for the guardians, no expectation that rulers will govern through pure knowledge of the good. Instead, the Laws proposes a carefully crafted legal code designed to shape character over generations. Law becomes the educator, establishing patterns of behavior that gradually form virtue through habit and custom. The city is smaller and more traditional, its economy based on agriculture rather than trade, its society more stable and less innovative than the dynamic Athens Plato had known. Yet even in this pragmatic work, Plato's philosophical commitments remain. The Laws are not arbitrary, but are grounded in reason and aim at virtue. Education remains central. The dialogue devotes extensive attention to how children should be raised and what they should learn. The gods are real and providential, caring about human affairs and ensuring that ultimately justice will be done. And philosophy, though not dominant as in the Republic, still has its place as the highest human activity for those capable of pursuing it. The Laws was apparently still being revised when Plato died. Our ancient sources mention a pupil who edited the final version for publication. This seems fitting for a philosopher who never claimed final certainty, who continued questioning and examining throughout his life, and who understood that the pursuit of wisdom is never complete. Alongside his writing, Plato continued leading the academy, teaching students, supervising research, and maintaining the philosophical community he had created. The academy in his final years was a flourishing institution, attracting students from across the Greek world and beyond. Among them was Aristotle, who had arrived as a teenager around 367 BCE and would remain at the academy for 20 years, studying with Plato and developing his own philosophical approach. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle during these years must have been complex. Aristotle was brilliant, independent-minded, and increasingly critical of certain Platonic doctrines, particularly the theory of forms. Yet he clearly respected Plato deeply and was profoundly influenced by his years at the academy, even where he disagreed. Plato apparently recognized Aristotle's abilities, the tradition that he called Aristotle, the mind of the academy, suggests genuine appreciation. But Aristotle would not inherit leadership of the academy. When Plato died in 347 BCE, the position passed to Speusippus, Plato's nephew, who would lead the institution in a more mathematical and Pythagorean direction. Aristotle left Athens and would eventually found his own school, the Lyceum, developing a philosophical system that in many ways opposed Platonism. This divergence among Plato's successors itself reflects something important about his approach to philosophy. He had not created a dogmatic sect requiring adherence to fixed doctrines, but had established a tradition of inquiry that encouraged following arguments wherever they led. His students disagreed with each other and with him, but all had been shaped by engagement with his thought and by the methods of careful argumentation and examination he had taught. Plato died in 347 BCE at age 80 or 81. The ancient sources offer few details about his death. Some say he died in his sleep after a wedding feast, others that he died while writing. What is clear is that he died in Athens, at the academy he had founded, having devoted his final decades to the philosophical work that was his true vocation. His legacy was immediate and enduring. The academy would continue for centuries, preserving and developing Platonic philosophy through various transformations. His dialogues were copied and studied, becoming foundational texts for ancient philosophy. And his influence extended far beyond those who identified as Platonists. Even philosophers who rejected his conclusions had to engage with his questions and arguments. But what exactly is Plato's legacy? What did he accomplish that makes him, over 2 millennia later, still read and studied, still influencing how we think about fundamental questions? First, Plato established philosophy as a systematic discipline. Before him, there were individual thinkers offering insights about nature, ethics, or knowledge, but there was no comprehensive system integrating metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics into a coherent whole. Plato created such a system, showing how questions in different areas connected and how philosophical inquiry could be rigorous and methodical. Second, Plato identified and articulated clearly many of the central problems that philosophy still addresses. The problem of universals, how general concepts relate to particular things. The problem of knowledge, what distinguishes knowledge from mere belief. The problem of the relationship between mind and body, between reason and desire, between the individual and society. The question of whether moral values are objective or relative. These and countless other problems were not invented by Plato, but he formulated them with a clarity and depth that made them unavoidable for subsequent thinkers. Third, Plato demonstrated that rational inquiry could address questions about value as well as about fact. Before him, the sophists had suggested that ethics and politics were merely matters of convention or power, without objective standards. Plato insisted that reason could establish truths about how we should live, about what is truly good and just, about what constitutes human flourishing. Whether or not one accepts his specific conclusions, his insistence that normative questions admit of rational examination opened space for ethical philosophy as a serious discipline. Fourth, Plato created an enduring model of philosophical education and community. The academy showed that philosophy was not just an individual pursuit, but could be cultivated through institutions, through collaborative inquiry, through systematic education. The ideal of the philosophical life, devoted to understanding, to virtue, to contemplation of truth, has inspired countless individuals across cultures and centuries. Fifth, Plato wrote beautifully. His dialogues are not just philosophically profound, but literarily excellent, combining dramatic vividness, characterization, humor, pathos, and poetry with rigorous argumentation. They can be read for pleasure as well as for instruction, and they communicate philosophical ideas in ways that engage both intellect and imagination. This combination of literary artistry and philosophical depth is rare and helps explain why Plato is read, while many other ancient philosophers are known only through fragments and summaries. But Plato's legacy also includes questions that remain unresolved and tensions that continue to generate debate. His confidence that reason can discover objective truth has been challenged by those who emphasize the limits of human knowledge or the perspectival nature of understanding. His political proposals for rule by philosophical experts trouble those who value democracy and political participation. His emphasis on eternal forms over temporal particulars can seem otherworldly, dismissive of the everyday life most people actually live. And his influence has been both positive and problematic. Alfred North Whitehead famously said that all of Western philosophy consists of footnotes to Plato, acknowledging the profound extent of his influence. But that influence has sometimes meant that later thinkers remained trapped within Platonic frameworks, even when those frameworks might not have been appropriate. The denigration of the body in favor of the soul, for instance, has had negative effects in Western culture, contributing to unhealthy attitudes toward physicality and embodiment. Yet these criticisms, while important, do not diminish Plato's fundamental achievement. He took seriously the deepest questions human beings can ask. What is real? What can we know? How should we live? And pursued them with unprecedented rigor, system, and literary power. He created models of philosophical inquiry, education, and community that continue to shape how we approach these questions. And he insisted that these questions matter, that pursuing wisdom is worthwhile regardless of practical utility, that the examined life is indeed worth living. The evening light fades over Athens. In the Academy's garden, discussions continue, as they have for decades. Students debate the nature of justice, examine geometrical proofs, question what can truly be known. An old man's voice is absent now, but the conversations continue, animated by the same eros that drove his lifelong pursuit of wisdom. This is perhaps Plato's deepest legacy, not specific doctrines or political proposals, but the example of a life devoted to understanding, the demonstration that philosophical inquiry is humanity's highest activity, and the faith that reason and love of truth can illuminate even the most difficult questions about existence, knowledge, and value. Whether or not the forms exist as independent realities, whether or not the soul is immortal, whether or not philosopher kings could actually govern justly, these remain debatable. But that these questions are worth asking, that pursuing answers through careful argument and examination is valuable, that the life devoted to such pursuit is noble and fulfilling. These insights survive every criticism and continue to inspire anyone who has ever wondered about the fundamental nature of reality or the proper way to live. More than 2,000 years has passed since Plato walked the streets of Athens, taught in the Academy's gardens, and composed the dialogues that would shape Western thought. Empires have risen and fallen. Cultures have emerged and transformed. Technologies Plato could not have imagined have reshaped human life. Yet his questions remain urgent, his insights still resonate, and his influence continues to shape how we think about ourselves and our world. This enduring relevance stems partly from the timeless nature of the questions Plato addressed. Human beings in every age and culture wonder about the nature of reality, about what we can truly know, about how we should live and how societies should be organized. These are not questions that admit of final answers, that once discovered, close inquiry. They are perennial questions, arising anew in each generation, requiring continuous examination in light of changing circumstances, while drawing on accumulated wisdom from past thinkers. Plato's approach to these questions established patterns that remain influential. He insisted on careful definition of terms before discussion could proceed productively. He emphasized following arguments wherever they led, even to unexpected or uncomfortable conclusions. He demonstrated the value of considering multiple perspectives before reaching judgment. He showed that abstract reasoning and concrete examples both have roles in philosophical inquiry. And he maintained that truth matters more than victory in argument, that the goal is understanding rather than rhetorical success. These methodological commitments shape philosophical practice to this day. Graduate seminars in philosophy still employ Socratic questioning. Academic articles still begin with careful definitions. Philosophical arguments still aim to follow logical necessity rather than to persuade through rhetorical flourish. The standards of rigor that Plato helped establish remain ideals for philosophical inquiry across very different philosophical traditions. But Plato's legacy extends beyond professional philosophy. His ideas have influenced theology, political theory, educational philosophy, aesthetics, psychology, and many other fields. Early Christian theologians found in Platonism conceptual resources for articulating doctrines about God, the soul, and spiritual realities. Islamic and Jewish medieval philosophers synthesized Platonic and Aristotelian thought into comprehensive systems. Renaissance humanists rediscovered Plato and celebrated his vision of human dignity and the soul's capacity for transcendence. In political thought, Plato's conviction that government should be based on wisdom and virtue rather than on power or popular opinion has inspired both utopian visions and skepticism about democracy. His emphasis on education as the foundation of good governance influences those who believe that civic virtue must be cultivated rather than assumed. His warnings about how democracies can decline into tyranny remain sobering for contemporary democratic societies. In aesthetics, Plato's teaching about beauty and its relationship to truth continues to shape discussions about art's nature and value. His concern that art can shape character for good or ill resonates with ongoing debates about media influence and artistic responsibility. His vision of beauty as pointing toward transcendent realities inspires artists and critics who resist reducing art to mere entertainment or self-expression. In educational philosophy, Plato's comprehensive approach to forming the whole person, body, emotion, and intellect, remains an ideal even if difficult to implement. His attention to developmentally appropriate methods, his insistence on mathematics as prerequisite for philosophy, his emphasis on dialectical inquiry over passive reception of information. All these continue to influence educational reform movements that resist reducing education to mere job training or information transfer. And in psychology, Plato's tripartite model of the soul, reason, spirit, appetite, anticipates modern theories about different psychological systems, the conflicts between them, and the challenge of achieving integration. His understanding that reason must work with emotions rather than simply suppressing them prefigures contemporary approaches in cognitive behavioral therapy and emotional regulation. His teaching that self-knowledge is essential for well-being echoes throughout therapeutic traditions. But perhaps Plato's most profound legacy is the vision of the philosophical life itself, the idea that human beings can and should devote themselves to understanding truth, that this pursuit is intrinsically valuable and constitutes the highest human activity, and that living according to reason and virtue is its own reward, regardless of external circumstances. This vision stands in tension with many contemporary values. We live in cultures that often prioritize practical utility over theoretical understanding, that value success and achievement over contemplation, that judge lives by wealth accumulated or status attained rather than by wisdom pursued or virtue cultivated. The philosophical life, as Plato understood it, can seem impractical or even escapist. Why spend years studying abstract questions when there are concrete problems to solve, money to earn, power to seek? Plato would respond that these apparently practical pursuits are actually less practical than philosophy, because they pursue goods without understanding what is truly good, means without clarity about proper ends. The successful business person who has never examined what wealth is for, the powerful politician who has never thought carefully about justice, the famous artist who has never considered what makes something beautiful, all are, from Plato's perspective, living unreflectively, pursuing shadows without understanding realities. Moreover, the unexamined life, as Socrates taught, is not worth living. A human life lived without reflection, without questioning, without attempting to understand oneself and one's world, is wasted regardless of what it achieves by conventional measures. The examined life, by contrast, has inherent worth even if it achieves nothing that impresses others. This is a radical claim, challenging conventional values across cultures and eras, yet it continues to attract those who sense that life must mean more than mere survival, reproduction, and accumulation. The philosophical life Plato celebrated is not for everyone. He acknowledged this, designing political systems with roles for different types of people. Most will not become philosophers, will not pursue systematic understanding of fundamental questions, will not ascend the ladder of love to vision of beauty itself. But everyone can benefit from some degree of philosophical reflection, some examination of their beliefs and values, some attempt to understand rather than simply to accept what they have been taught. And those few who do devote themselves to philosophy, who make it their vocation rather than just a passing interest, will find in Plato a model and an inspiration. The life devoted to seeking wisdom, to following arguments wherever they lead, to valuing truth above comfort or convention, to pursuing understanding even when it brings no obvious practical benefit. This life, Plato demonstrated, is possible, is worth living, and is its own justification. Plato himself exemplified this life. Born into privilege, with every opportunity for political power and worldly success, he chose instead to pursue philosophy. He could have remained safely in his studies, but he attempted to influence Syracuse, risking his life for the possibility of implementing philosophical principles in political practice. When those attempts failed, he did not abandon philosophy for more conventional pursuits, but returned to the academy, to teaching and writing, to the work he understood as truly important. His final decades, devoted to his school and his students, to refining his philosophical system and examining problems his earlier works had raised, to continuing the pursuit of wisdom until his death. These represent the philosophical life in its mature form. Not the young man's philosophical enthusiasm, but the old man's sustained commitment to inquiry, teaching, and the love of wisdom that had animated his entire adult life. What would Plato make of our contemporary world? We can only speculate, but surely he would be both impressed and disturbed. Impressed by the extent of scientific knowledge, by technologies that would seem magical, by the preservation and dissemination of his own writings across cultures and millennia. But disturbed by the uses to which knowledge and technology are put, by the power of rhetoric and manipulation in democratic societies, by the prevalence of relativism and the denial of objective truth, by the prioritization of practical utility over theoretical understanding. He would likely note that the problems he identified, the tension between knowledge and opinion, the challenge of educating citizens for virtue, the difficulty of ensuring that political power serves justice rather than self-interest, the tendency of democracies toward demagoguery, remain unsolved. We have not found ways to make philosopher kings rule, have not created educational systems that consistently produce virtuous citizens, have not eliminated the gap between what we know we should do and what we actually do. But he might also be encouraged by the persistence of philosophical inquiry, by the continued existence of institutions devoted to learning and understanding, by the individuals in every generation who choose to pursue wisdom rather than mere success. The academy may have closed in 529 CE, but universities and institutes continue its mission. The particular forms change, but the commitment to rational inquiry and the pursuit of truth endures. And he might note that his fundamental insight, that examined life is better than unexamined life, that truth matters even when inconvenient, that justice is preferable to injustice regardless of consequences, that the soul is more valuable than the body, that eternal realities are more important than temporal pleasures, continues to attract those who sense that conventional values do not exhaust what makes life meaningful. As stars emerge in the darkening sky over Athens, a modern visitor might stand where the academy once flourished, where Plato taught and Aristotle studied, where generations of students pursued wisdom in philosophical community. The buildings are long gone, the gardens returned to wild growth or covered by urban development. But what those buildings housed and those gardens witnessed, the conversations, the arguments, the sudden insights, the gradual accumulation of understanding, the friendships formed through shared love of wisdom. This continues wherever human beings gather to examine fundamental questions. This is Plato's truest legacy, more enduring than any institution or doctrine, the demonstration that human life admits of self-examination and can be guided by reason, that pursuing understanding is intrinsically worthwhile, that wisdom and virtue matter more than wealth and power, and that philosophy, the love of wisdom, represents humanity's highest calling and noblest achievement. The questions Plato raised remain open. The forms may or may not exist as independent realities, but the problem of universals persists. The soul may or may not be immortal, but questions about consciousness and identity continue. The ideal city may be impossible, but the challenge of creating just political institutions remains. These are not failures of Plato's philosophy, but testaments to the depth and importance of his questions. For genuine questions, the kind that matter most, rarely admit of final definitive answers that close inquiry. Instead, they invite continuous examination, refinement of understanding, and new perspectives that illuminate aspects previous generations did not see. Plato knew this. His dialogues often end without definitive conclusions, inviting readers to continue the inquiry, to follow arguments further, to examine their own beliefs in light of what has been discussed. This open-ended quality, this invitation to philosophical engagement rather than passive reception of doctrines, may be Plato's greatest gift to humanity. He does not offer a system to be memorized and applied, but a method to be practiced, questions to be pursued, and the inspiration of a life devoted to wisdom. These remain available to anyone willing to examine their beliefs, to follow arguments wherever they lead, and to love truth more than comfort. As night deepens and the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the questions Plato asked echo across the centuries. What is justice? What is beauty? What is knowledge? What is the good? How should we live? These questions outlast empires and survive cultural transformations because they address what is essentially and permanently human: our capacity for reason, our longing for understanding, our desire to live well and to create communities worthy of our highest aspirations. Plato's answer, refined through a lifetime of inquiry, was that we should pursue wisdom through philosophy, cultivate virtue through education, order our souls according to reason, and create communities that promote human flourishing. Whether in ancient Athens or the modern world, these remain worthy goals, and the path Plato illuminated, the examined life devoted to truth and guided by love of the good, remains open to any who choose to walk it. The philosopher who was born into privilege but chose wisdom over power, who witnessed his teacher's unjust execution but continued pursuing justice, who failed to reform Syracuse but succeeded in establishing philosophy as humanity's highest calling. Plato rests now, his work complete. But his questions persist, his dialogues continue to be read, and his vision of the philosophical life continues to inspire anyone who senses that truth matters, that understanding is valuable, and that the examined life is indeed worth living. In this, perhaps, lies the deepest meaning of Plato's legacy. Not in specific doctrines that may be accepted or rejected, but in the enduring demonstration that human beings can transcend their immediate circumstances through reason, can pursue truth systematically and rigorously, and can find in philosophy a way of life that is noble, beautiful, and profoundly fulfilling. This possibility remains open, this path remains available, and this calling continues to resound across the ages, inviting each generation anew to love wisdom and to seek understanding.